Firebase Charlie K. Son Valley, Vietnam. March 1971. The kind of heat that makes a man forget what cold feels like. The kind that turns sweat into streams and streams into rivers that carve channels through the red dirt, caking every exposed inch of skin. Corporal Henry Hayes, 22 years old and 3 months into his second tour, pressed his face against sandbags that smelled like death and cordite and the particular terror of men who know they're not going home. The mortar fire had stopped 5 minutes ago. That was worse than the shelling. Silence meant movement. Silence meant they were coming. Henry's squad, 11 men this morning, 6 now huddled in what remained of the firebase perimeter. The NVA had hit them at dawn, overran the western bunkers before anyone understood what was happening. Now Firebase Charlie was a name on a map that would be crossed out by nightfall, another coordinate where American boys learned the exact weight of their souls. He checked his M16 for the 4th time in as many minutes. 17 rounds left. The radio operator was dead, his body sprawled across the useless equipment, static hissing like a final breath that never quite finished. Movement. 50 meters out, tree line. Henry's finger found the trigger, his heart hammered against ribs that felt too thin to contain it. 22 years old. He'd never kissed a girl without thinking about forever. Never stood in a church without imagining his own wedding. Never looked at an empty storefront without seeing what it could become with the right dream and enough sweat. The tree line erupted. Not NVA. Marines. 3 of them moving fast, dragging a 4th. Even at this distance, Henry could see the blood, could see the way the wounded man's legs weren't working right, the way his head lolled like all the strings had been cut. Behind them, muzzle flashes. The NVA were coming through, using the Marines as bait to draw out anyone still alive in the firebase. The smart play was to stay down, wait them out, maybe slip away when darkness came. The smart play kept you breathing. Henry was over the sandbags before his brain caught up to his legs. The distance between the perimeter and those Marines was 60 meters of open ground, no cover every step, an invitation for a bullet to find the space between his shoulders. He ran anyway, M16 up, firing suppressing bursts toward the tree line without aiming, just noise and muzzle flash, and the hope that uncertainty buys you seconds. One of the Marines saw him coming, eyes wide, with something between hope and horror. He was young, they were all young, maybe 19, with the kind of baby face that made you wonder if he'd lied about his age at the recruitment office. His name tape read Morrison. Morrison's buddy was the wounded one, unconscious now, blood turning his uniform into a geography of trauma. The 3rd Marine was trying to pull them both. But you can't pull 2 men through a kill zone, not when bullets are drawing lines in the air around you, like a geometry proof written in lead and prayer. Henry hit the deck beside them, the impact driving air from his lungs. Morrison stared at him like he was hallucinating. Blood from a scalp wound had turned half the kid's face into a mask. His voice came out broken. "Who? Shut up and move!" Henry grabbed the wounded Marine's gear, started dragging. Morrison took the legs. The 3rd Marine laid down covering fire, his rifle chattering in short controlled bursts that spoke of training remembered through the fog of adrenaline and terror. They made 30 meters before Henry's world turned into noise and pressure and the sensation of flying without ever leaving the ground. The mortar round hit close enough to turn dirt into shrapnel, close enough that the concussion felt like God's palm slapping him across the face. He couldn't hear anything except ringing. Couldn't see anything except shapes moving through smoke. Someone was pulling him now, hands rough on his gear, dragging him backward. He tried to help, tried to get his legs working, but they belonged to someone else, now somewhere far away. The firebase perimeter appeared through the smoke. Sandbags, cover. They tumbled over, landing in a heap of blood and equipment and gasping breaths that sounded like drowning. Morrison's face swam into focus above him. The kid was crying and laughing at the same time, the way you do when you've seen your own death and somehow sidestep it. His hands pressed against something on Henry's chest. When had he been hit? And the pressure sent lightning through every nerve. Morrison's mouth moved. No sound reached Henry through the ringing, but he could read the words, "You saved my life. You saved my fucking life." Henry tried to answer, tried to say it was nothing, tried to explain that you don't think about saving lives when you run into fire. You just run because standing still means watching men die. And you've already watched too many men die, and something inside you breaks if you watch one more. But his mouth wouldn't work right, filled with copper and salt. The kid leaned close, his voice breaking through the ringing. Nobody dies today, brother. You hear me? Nobody dies today. Helicopters overhead. Dust off incoming. Someone was tying a tourniquet around Henry's leg when had he been hit in the leg, and the pain was a living thing now, bright and immediate, and almost welcome because pain meant alive. Morrison gripped his hand, squeezed hard enough to feel through the shock. His eyes were locked on Henry's, and in them was something more than gratitude, something deeper. A debt acknowledged. A bond formed in blood and cordite. Henry's vision started to tunnel. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him was that kid's face, solemn as a vow. If I make it home, I'm gonna find you. I'm gonna repay this. On my life, brother. On my life. The darkness came soft as a blanket. Memphis, Tennessee. Present day. Thunder doesn't crash in Memphis so much as it rolls a sustained rumble that starts somewhere over Arkansas and gathers momentum as it crosses the Mississippi, arrives downtown with all the authority of a freight train that's forgotten how to brake. The first crack split the air at 11:47 p.m., and Margaret Hayes Maggie, to anyone who'd known her longer than 5 minutes, looked up from the grill she'd been scrubbing for the past hour, like maybe she could see through the ceiling and into whatever judgment the sky was preparing to deliver. The diner was empty. Had been empty since 7 when the last customer, Mr. Patterson, loyal as sunrise, had shuffled out with his to-go container of meatloaf and the kind of smile that made you remember why you got up at 4:30 every morning, even when your knees screamed and your back felt like someone had been using it for hammer practice. The kind of smile that said your existence mattered to at least one other human being on this turning earth. Maggie dried her hands on a towel that had been white in a previous geological epoch, now more of a gray that suggested resignation. The radio on the shelf behind the counter hissed static between weather warnings. Severe thunderstorm warning for Shelby County. Tornado watch in effect until 3 a.m. Residents advised to seek shelter immediately. Flooding expected in low-lying areas. Do not attempt to travel unless absolutely necessary. She should have closed 3 hours ago. Should have been home in her apartment above the Korean grocery on Union Avenue, where the pipes knocked like they were trying to communicate in Morse code, and the heating worked on a schedule known only to itself. Should have been a lot of things by 73, including dead, if the actuarial tables had anything to say about it. But dead would have been easier than what she was carrying now. The bills sat on the counter where she'd laid them out this afternoon, arranged by urgency, like a triage nurse sorting casualties. Hutchins Properties, $4,800 past due, 3 months. The word final stamped in red across the top like a sentencing. Electric Company, $890, 90 days delinquent disconnection, scheduled for Friday. Food supplier, $1,400 outstanding, no further deliveries until account settled. And underneath them all, creased from being folded and refolded and studied, like it might reveal some hidden loophole in the arithmetic of failure, an offer from Hutchins Development Corporation to purchase her lease for $75,000. Third notice. Each one higher than the last, each one signed by Victor Hutchins in a script that managed to look expensive and threatening at the same time. She'd crumpled the first two, thrown them in the trash where they belonged. This one she'd kept not because she was considering it, but because the enemy's terms should always be studied. Henry had taught her that during one of his evening seminars on strategy that always somehow circled back to Vietnam and the lessons learned when the cost of tuition is measured in body bags. Henry. 5 years gone this November, and still the first person she talked to every morning. Lightning turned the world outside to stark white geometry, every raindrop suspended like accusations. The thunder followed 3 seconds later, close enough that the windows rattled in their frames. This was going to be bad. The Weather Service didn't issue tornado watches lightly, not in Memphis, where the river and the bluffs created wind patterns that could turn a summer squall into something biblical. Maggie walked to the front window, looked out at Elm Street, transformed into a river. The storm drains couldn't handle this kind of volume. They'd been inadequate when the city installed them in 1962 and hadn't improved with age. Water swirled past carrying leaves and trash, and what looked like someone's mailbox, all of it moving south toward the river, like everything in Memphis eventually moved toward the river. No one was out there. No one with sense anyway. She should lock up, should go home, should surrender to the storm and the bills and the slow-motion catastrophe of everything she and Henry had spent 40 years building. Should accept that some fights can't be won with stubbornness and 4:30 wake-ups, and the kind of love that makes you keep feeding people who can't afford to pay, because feeding people is what you do, what you've always done, what you'll keep doing until they carry you out feet first. Her hand was on the deadbolt when she heard it. Motorcycles. Multiple engines, the deep rumble of big bikes cutting through the storm's white noise like a blade through silk. The sound grew louder, closer, until it was right outside, until she could feel it in her chest, in her bones, in the space behind her eyes where headaches live. The engines cut out. Just rain now hammering the windows, and underneath it, the unmistakable sound of boots on pavement. Multiple boots. Multiple men. Maggie's hand moved from the deadbolt to the phone on the wall beside the door. Her fingers found 911, didn't press it yet, waited. Her heart was doing something complicated against her ribs, a rhythm that felt like warning. Through the rain-distorted glass, she could see them. 9 shapes moving in the darkness. Massive men in leather water streaming off jackets that looked black in the insufficient light from the street lamp across the road. One of them turned his head, and in the lightning flash, she saw it, the patch on his back skull and wings, and words she couldn't make out but didn't need to, because everyone knew that patch. Everyone in Memphis had seen the news stories. Everyone had heard the warnings. Hell's Angels. Her finger hovered over the one, ready to complete the call, ready to bring sirens and authority and all the mechanisms a civilized society maintains for keeping its citizens safe from men who wear death on their backs and make their own laws. But something stopped her. Something in the way they moved, the formation they kept as they approached the door. Not spreading out like predators, not checking escape routes, or casing the building the way men do when they're planning something that requires violence and speed. They were clustered around something, someone in their center, and the posture wasn't predatory. It was protective. The lead man reached the door. He was huge, the kind of size that makes you recalculate what you thought human beings were capable of containing within their frames. Beard wet with rain, streaked with gray. Arms covered in ink that probably told stories she didn't want to know. He cupped his hands against the glass, peered inside, and his eyes found hers through the storm and the darkness and all the space between what she thought she knew about danger and what she was actually seeing. His mouth moved. She couldn't hear the word over the storm, but she could read his lips. Please. Not a demand, not a threat. A request from someone who understood he had no right to expect anything, who was asking anyway, because asking was all he had left. Behind him, the other men shifted, and she saw what they were protecting. A younger man, early 20s, maybe, supported between 2 of the bikers. His head lolled forward, unconscious or close to it. Even through the distortion of rain and glass, she could see the blood dark against his jeans spreading from somewhere around his thigh. The lead man knocked on the glass, not pounding, just knocking the way any customer might knock when they're hoping the sign that says closed might be negotiable. His voice carried through the door, through the storm. Ma'am, we're not looking for trouble. Lightning again, closer, turning everything to silver and shadow. We've got a man down. Medical emergency. Maggie's hand stayed on the phone, but her eyes stayed on that young man's face, on the way his skin looked too pale, even accounting for the poor light, on the way his breathing looked shallow in the rise and fall of his chest. The lead man continued, voice raised to carry over the rain. Roads are flooded out there. Can't get him to a hospital. He's bleeding bad. Maggie looked closer. The man they were holding was young enough to be her grandson if she'd had children, if Henry's construction accident hadn't happened before they could get around to starting a family, if a lot of things had gone differently than they actually went. Young enough that someone somewhere loved him the way she'd loved Henry, would be destroyed by losing him the way she'd been destroyed. Please, ma'am. The lead man's voice cracked just slightly on the last word. We just need shelter till we can get help. Henry's voice clear, as if he were standing beside her the way it always came when she needed him most. Sometimes the angels come disguised as the people we're most afraid of. He'd said that watching the news, some story about a homeless man who'd saved a family from a fire, how everyone had crossed the street to avoid him for months before he turned hero. Henry had this way of seeing through surfaces to the truth underneath the thing that made him run into machine gun fire. For a kid, he didn't know the thing that made him spend 30 years feeding a neighborhood that couldn't always afford to pay. Maggie looked at these 9 men through the glass. They were huge, intimidating, covered in leather, in patches that screamed danger with every thread. But they weren't acting like predators. They were acting like brothers trying to save one of their own, desperate enough to beg help from a 73-year-old black woman running a failing diner in the middle of a storm that looked like God's own anger. She made her decision. Her hand left the phone, found the deadbolt. The metal was cold under her fingers, cold as doubt, cold as the moment before you step off a cliff and hope there's something solid at the bottom. She looked back one more time at Henry's photograph on the wall, at his smile from 1972, at the Purple Heart and Bronze Star in the case beside his wedding photo, at the proof that some men were worth the risk of believing in. "Henry," she whispered, "I hope you're watching over me now." The deadbolt clicked open. The door swung wide and rain blasted into the diner like it had been waiting for the invitation, wind and water, and the smell of ozone and asphalt turning the familiar space into something electric. The 9 men stood in the doorway, water streaming from leather, looking like something out of every nightmare she'd never quite remembered upon waking. Maggie stepped back, gestured toward the nearest booth. Her voice came out steady, steadier than she felt. "Bring him in, hurry now." And what she didn't know, couldn't know, was that she'd just opened her door to a debt 50 years in the making. That the man with the gray-streaked beard was named Jack Morrison. That he'd been 20 years old when a corporal named Henry Hayes ran through machine gun fire to save him at Firebase Charlie. That he'd spent decades trying to repay that debt and failing, because how do you repay someone for your entire life? For your children, for everything you ever built, or loved, or became? That the young man bleeding in her doorway was Jack's son, Daniel, and that Daniel had sat in this very diner 10 years ago when he was 16 and running from a father he thought didn't understand him, and that an elderly black woman had fed him for 2 weeks and never charged a penny, and talked him into calling home, talked him into believing that love sometimes looks like conflict, when fathers don't know any other way to prepare their sons for a world that takes no prisoners. That everything was about to change in ways that would destroy her before it saved her, would cost her everything she had before giving her more than she'd ever imagined. Maggie didn't know any of that. She just stepped back and let the angels in. They filed through the door like an invasion made polite by desperation, 9 massive men trying to move carefully through a space built for ordinary humans, trying not to knock over chairs, or track too much water, or take up more room than absolutely necessary. It was like watching bears try to navigate a dollhouse, all lethal capability, constrained by the understanding that this was someone else's home and you didn't break what wasn't yours. The lead man removed his helmet and Maggie got her first clear look at his face. Late 50s maybe, with the kind of weathered features that spoke of decades spent outside in weather, in elements that carved their passage into skin. His eyes were brown, red-rimmed with exhaustion, but kind. That surprised her more than anything. The kindness in eyes set in a face designed to make people step back, give ground, remember they had somewhere else to be. His voice was gravelly but careful. "Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much." The others echoed him a chorus of "yes, ma'am," and "much obliged, ma'am," and "thank you," in voices that ranged from bass rumble to something close to tears. They were saying ma'am like they'd been raised by mothers who taught them that respect costs nothing and buys everything that matters. Like they understood they were in the presence of someone who'd just given them something precious and unearned. Maggie blinked, refocused. The shock was trying to take hold, 9 Hells Angels saying ma'am, like they were at church, but shock was a luxury she couldn't afford when there was blood on her floor and a man who needed help. "Put him right here." She cleared the nearest booth with quick, efficient movements, pushing aside the salt and pepper shakers, the napkin dispenser, the plastic menu that hadn't changed in 5 years because changing menus cost money, and money was something that lived in other people's lives. Years of running a diner had taught her how to handle emergencies, how bodies break and blood flows and pain moves through a person like electricity through water. They laid him down as gently as men that size could manage, which was surprisingly gentle, the kind of careful that spoke of practice of having carried wounded before. The young man's eyes fluttered but didn't open. His skin had that waxy quality that meant shock, that meant the body was shutting down non-essential systems to keep the core alive, that meant you had minutes, not hours. "What's his name?" Maggie grabbed clean towels from behind the counter, her legs moving on autopilot while her brain cataloged injuries. blood-soaked jeans around the right thigh, breathing too shallow, the pulse probably weak, shock setting in hard. The lead man's voice was rough. Danny. His name's Danny. Something flickered in Maggie's mind the way it does when you hear a name that should mean something that carries weight you can't quite identify. But there was no time to examine it. No time for anything except the immediate crisis of keeping this boy alive. What happened to him? Bike slid out on wet road about 5 miles back. Hit a guardrail. We got him this far, but the lead man's voice died in his throat. The rest of the sentence too terrible to complete. But we're losing him. Maggie examined the wound. Deep gash across the right thigh, maybe 6 inches long. Blood flow steady, but not arterial, which meant they had time if they were smart, if they were lucky, if God felt like handing out miracles to elderly women who opened their doors to strangers against every instinct that evolution and experience had spent decades installing. She'd seen worse. Henry had worked construction for 30 years, and construction was an industry that fed men into machines and spit out casualties with the regularity of a production line. She'd patched him up a dozen times, learned basic field medicine from necessity and from loving someone who chose a profession where danger was a daily companion. Danny, honey, can you hear me? Her voice slipped into the register she'd used with every scared kid who'd ever sat at her counter, the grandmother voice that suggested comfort was possible, even when evidence suggested otherwise. The young man's eyes fluttered open, blue eyes striking even through the haze of pain and shock. They focused on her with difficulty, confusion giving way to something that looked almost like recognition, like he knew her from somewhere he couldn't quite place. His voice came out as a whisper, "Ma'am, I—" He tried to say more, but pain cut him off, his face twisting. "Hush now, baby. You're not bothering anybody. I'm going to take care of you." Maggie turned to the bikers, and the fear that had been riding her since she'd seen them through the window was evaporating, burned away by purpose. "I need you boys to move those tables. Make space, and somebody get me towels from the kitchen. Clean ones in the cabinet beside the sink." They moved like a military unit. No questions, no hesitation, just immediate coordinated action. The one closest to the kitchen disappeared through the swinging door. Two others started clearing furniture, lifting tables like they weighed nothing, stacking chairs with a precision that spoke of training remembered. Maggie noticed how they followed orders. This wasn't case. This was organization discipline, the kind that gets installed in boot camp and never quite leaves even when the uniform comes off. "What's your name, honey?" she asked the lead biker while pressing a clean towel against Danny's wound, applying pressure the way Henry had taught her, firm, but not crushing, sustained but not panicked. "They call me Captain, ma'am." Ma'am. He watched her work with growing amazement in his eyes, like he was recalibrating what he thought he knew about elderly women and their capabilities under pressure. "Well, Captain, you and your boys did right getting him here. This wound's deep, but he's going to be fine if we keep the bleeding controlled and get him warmed up." She looked up at the 9 men surrounding her booth. These massive figures now transformed into something else. Scared brothers watching one of their own slip away. "Are you boys hungry?" The question landed in the space like a stone, and still water ripples of confusion spreading across faces that had been set for crisis. They'd expected many things: rejection, police, fear, maybe violence, but not this. Not an offer of food from a woman who had every reason to send them back into the storm. Captain's voice carried genuine bewilderment. "Ma'am, we don't want to impose. Baby, you're already here bleeding on my booth. The least I can do is make sure y'all get fed." Maggie didn't look up from Danny's leg, her hands busy with towels and pressure, and the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned emergency medicine in the school of loving men who work dangerous jobs. "I got leftover meatloaf, some cornbread that's only a day old. Coffee that's been sitting too long, but it's hot." She glanced around at 9 dangerous men who suddenly looked like lost children standing in a stranger's kitchen, unsure of the rules, unsure of what was being offered or why. "Now sit yourselves down while I get you something to eat. And somebody tell me where the hospital is from here, because once I get this bleeding stopped, we're going to need real doctors." What followed was the strangest dinner service of Maggie's 40 years running Maggie's Place. 9 Hells Angels sitting in her diner, dripping wet water, pooling under their boots, speaking in voices kept deliberately quiet like they were afraid of breaking something more fragile than dishes. They used napkins, said please and thank you, like they'd been raised to believe manners mattered. When one of them started to put his boots up on a chair, another one stopped him with just a look, the kind of look that communicated volumes in the space between heartbeats. Maggie served them everything she had. Meatloaf that had been destined for tomorrow's lunch, special cornbread, she'd been planning to take home because waste was sin, and sin was something she'd been raised to avoid. Green beans that were a day from needing to be thrown out. Coffee that had been on the burner too long, but was hot and strong and would warm men who'd been riding through a storm. She didn't charge them, didn't even mention money. Some things transcended commerce, transcended the arithmetic of survival that had ruled her life for the past 5 years. These were men in trouble who'd asked for help. You didn't send an invoice for being human. Captain took his first bite of meatloaf and something changed in his face, some wall coming down. His voice carried wonder. Ma'am, this is the best meal we've had in months. Maggie waved him off while checking Danny's wound, changing the blood-soaked towel for a fresh one, noting that the bleeding was slowing. Day-old cornbread and leftover meatloaf. Don't try to flatter an old woman. No, ma'am, I'm serious. Captain set down his fork like he needed both hands free to convey what he was trying to say. It's not just the food, he searched for words, found them hiding in places he didn't usually look. It's being treated like human beings. The words hung in the air like smoke, like testimony, like confession. Maggie poured him more coffee and studied his face in the overhead fluorescence. Underneath the beard and the road dust and the intimidation that his size and appearance automatically generated, she saw something unexpected. Pain. Loneliness. The look of someone who'd been judged too many times, found wanting by people who never bothered to look past the leather and ink to whatever lived underneath. What's your real name, Captain? He hesitated, like the question had layers, like giving his name meant something more than simple introduction. Jack, ma'am, Jack Morrison. Morrison. The name triggered something in Maggie's memory, some association she couldn't quite catch, like trying to grab smoke. But it slipped away before she could examine it, and Danny chose that moment to moan, bringing her attention back to immediate concerns. The hours passed slow as continental drift. Maggie tended to Danny, changing his bandages, bringing him water when he was conscious enough to sip it, checking his temperature with her palm, the way her mother had taught her, the way mothers have taught daughters, since humans learned that fever meant the body was fighting, and fighting meant hope. Around 3 a.m., Danny's condition worsened. His skin was burning up, fever spiking, and when she managed to wake him, his eyes had that glazed quality that meant he wasn't fully present, that he was somewhere else, somewhere the pain couldn't follow. His lips moved, forming words that didn't quite make it to sound. Maggie recognized infection setting in. The wound needed cleaning, needed real medical attention, needed things she couldn't provide with towels and hot water, and 40-year-old memories of Henry coming home from construction sites with injuries that would have sent normal men to emergency rooms, but that he'd insisted were fine, were nothing, were just the cost of making a living with your hands. We need to get him to a hospital. She stood, decision made, no room for debate. Now, Jack's face went grim. Roads are still flooded, ma'am. Ambulances can't get through. I tried calling from my cell, no signal. Storm must have taken out the towers. Maggie walked to the window. The rain had lessened, but water still covered Elm Street curb to curb, moving fast enough that you could see the current, see debris rushing past. At least a foot deep, maybe 18 inches. Enough to stall a car, enough to sweep someone off their feet if they weren't careful enough to make driving to a hospital in anything with 4 wheels a gamble against physics and fate. Then we go to the hospital. Maggie grabbed her purse from under the counter, her keys from the hook by the door. Jack, your bike has room for a passenger. The 9 men exchanged looks, a conversation happening in glances and minute changes of expression, the kind of communication that happens between people who've ridden together long enough that words become optional. Jack's voice carried concern. Ma'am, that's dangerous. Water's high streets are flooded. You'd be riding in conditions. Honey, everything worth doing is dangerous. Maggie pulled on her coat, the same raincoat she'd been wearing for 15 years, duct tape on one sleeve where a tear had gotten too big to ignore. I've spent 40 years feeding people who needed feeding. I've spent 5 years trying to keep this place open against every reason to quit. I'm not about to stop doing what's right because it's dangerous. She looked at Jack Morrison and something passed between them. some understanding that transcended the circumstances of their meeting. His eyes held hers, and she saw in them something that reminded her of Henry in the months after he came home from Vietnam, that particular quality of men who'd seen the worst humans could do to each other and decided anyway to try for something better. Now let's go save this boy's life. The ride through Memphis at 4 a.m. was something Maggie would remember with perfect clarity for the rest of her days, every detail etched into memory with the precision of trauma or transcendence. Those moments when time moves different, when consciousness expands to contain more than it should be able to hold. She sat behind Jack on his Harley, her arms wrapped around his waist, around a leather jacket that was soaked through and cold against her hands. Danny was sandwiched between them unconscious, but breathing his weight supported by Maggie's grip and Jack's bulk, in the kind of desperate physics that happens when people refuse to let gravity and circumstances dictate outcomes. 8 other motorcycles formed an escort, 2 in front, 3 on each side of lights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness and the rain that had lessened to a steady fall. They moved slow, navigating flooded streets with the careful deliberation of men who understood that speed was an enemy when the margin for error measured in inches. Maggie had never been on a motorcycle before, had thought she never would be, had assumed motorcycles were for young people with something to prove and old people having a crisis, and neither category included 73-year-old widows trying to keep a diner from foreclosure. But here she was holding tight to a man she'd met 3 hours ago, carrying a young man who might die if they were too slow or too fast, or if God decided tonight wasn't a night for miracles. The engine vibrated through her whole body, a frequency that felt like prayer or panic or both at once. Water sprayed up from the front wheel, drenching her, despite the raincoat cold seeping through to skin that had stopped registering temperature in favor of just holding on, just keeping Danny stable, just making it to Memphis General before the infection or the shock or the bleeding finished what the crash had started. Jack's voice carried over the engine and the wind. "You okay back there? Don't you worry about me. Eyes on the road." They passed through downtown Memphis, past Beale Street, where the blues clubs sat dark and empty, past the Lorraine Motel where Dr. King had died, and where tourists came to feel something about history that locals just called Tuesday. Past the FedEx Forum where the Grizzlies played and where Maggie had never been because ticket prices lived in a different economic reality than the one that counted her life savings in double digits. The city looked different from the back of a motorcycle. Larger, more beautiful. Like a secret had been revealed, like she'd been living inside a snow globe, and someone had finally picked it up, given it a shake, shown her that the world was bigger than the 6 blocks between her apartment and her diner. Jack took a corner, and Maggie felt Danny's weight shift, felt him slip, slightly tightened her grip until her arms screamed. Jack must have felt it too, because his left hand came down to help support Danny's weight, steering one-handed through a flood that could grab the front wheel and turn them all into statistics that would make the morning news if they were lucky, wouldn't make anything if they weren't. They made it to Memphis General in 17 minutes that felt like 17 hours. The emergency entrance was chaos controlled by exhaustion. EMTs and nurses moving with the efficient urgency of people who'd been at this all night, who would be at this all night tomorrow, who chose this work knowing that every shift was a war against entropy and pain and the 1,000 ways human bodies could fail. Jack pulled up to the ambulance bay, and Maggie helped ease Danny off the bike. 2 EMTs appeared with a gurney asking questions in overlapping voices. "What happened when? How long has he been unconscious? Any allergies? Any medications?" Jack and Edgar answered while Maggie stayed with Danny, her hand finding his as they transferred him to the gurney. Squeezing once in the universal language that said, "You're not alone," said, "Someone's here," said, "Hold on just a little longer because help has arrived." Danny's eyes opened, focused on her face with difficulty. His lips moved and she leaned close to hear, "Thank you." 2 words carrying weight beyond their syllables, carrying gratitude and recognition, and something else, something she couldn't quite identify. Then the EMTs were wheeling him through automatic doors that hissed open and closed, taking him to wherever hospitals take people who arrive bleeding at 4 a.m., and Maggie was left standing in the ambulance bay with 8 men in leather and rain that was finally starting to ease as dawn approached somewhere beyond the clouds. Jack removed his helmet. His hair was plastered to his skull, rain or sweat, or both. His eyes were red-rimmed with exhaustion and relief, and something that might have been tears if men who looked like him allowed themselves such luxuries. Ma'am, I don't know how to thank you. Maggie looked at this man who'd called her ma'am every time he'd spoken, who'd orchestrated the ride through flooded streets with the kind of calm competence that spoke of crisis management, learned elsewhere, practiced until it became reflex. She thought about the way his men had moved in her diner, the way they'd followed his orders without question, the way they'd treated her with a respect that transcended politeness and landed somewhere closer to reverence. You were military. It wasn't a question. Jack's face changed, something closing and opening simultaneously. Marines, long time ago. Vietnam. Yes, ma'am. How did you? My husband was 3rd Battalion 1st Marines, Khe Sanh. He came home with scars outside and in, and I learned to recognize the men who'd been there. Something in the eyes, something in the way you move. She paused, studying his face in the orange light of the emergency bay. Something in the way you understand that some things are worth the risk. Jack went very still. His voice came out careful. What was your husband's name? Henry Hayes. The name hit him like voltage, every muscle tensing, his eyes going wide, with something between shock and recognition, and a kind of grief that had been aged in oak barrels for 50 years. His hand came up, started toward her, fell back to his side like he'd forgotten what he'd meant to do with it. Henry Hayes. He repeated it like testing whether the words were real, whether speaking them might make something impossible suddenly true. Corporal Henry Hayes, 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines. That's right. Did you know him? Jack's next words came out broken. Ma'am, your husband saved my life. They sat in the Memphis General waiting room. 9 men in leather looking completely out of place among the institutional furniture and fluorescent lighting and the particular despair that lives in hospital waiting rooms at 4:30 in the morning. Other families clutched coffee and styrofoam cups and pretended not to stare at the bikers doing the arithmetic everyone does when they see Hell's Angels danger plus unpredictability equals keep your head down and hope they're not here for you. But the bikers weren't paying attention to anyone else. They were focused on their own, on the young man beyond the double doors, on whether he'd live or die, on whether the ride through flooded streets had been fast enough. Jack sat beside Maggie on institutional chairs that had been designed by someone who'd never had to sit in one for more than 5 minutes, someone who believed comfort was wasted on the worried. He'd been quiet since his confession, since revealing that Henry had pulled him out of Firebase Charlie in 1971, since learning that the woman who'd saved his boy tonight was the widow of the man who'd given him everything it dwarfed his 53 more years of breathing. Finally, he spoke. Firebase Charlie, March 71. I was 20 years old, private first class, 3 months in country. His voice had the quality of testimony of stories told because they must be told even when telling costs something. NVA overran our position at dawn. 11 men in my squad when the sun came up. 6 of us left when the mortar stopped. And then 3 Marines came running through the kill zone, dragging a 4th who wasn't going to make it without help. Maggie listened, her hands folded in her lap, fingers working over fingers, the way they did when she was trying to hold something together inside herself. I was the 4th. Leg wound, head wound, bleeding from places I didn't know you could bleed from. My buddies were trying to get me out, but you can't carry a man through that much fire, not when the NVA has you ranged, not when every second is borrowed time. Jack's eyes were somewhere else now, somewhere 50 years away, where the heat made metal too hot to touch, and fear was a taste in the back of your throat. Then this corporal comes over the sandbags like he's running to catch a bus, like there's not bullets drawing lines in the air around him. He grabbed my gear, and we made 30 meters before a mortar round tried to rewrite the laws of physics with us as the chalk. He fell silent, remembering explosions and impact, and the way your brain stops recording an order and just captures fragments. Blood smoke, hands, pulling voices, shouting helicopter, rotors somewhere overhead like mechanical angels. Your husband pulled me to safety. Got hit doing it, took shrapnel in the leg and chest, but he didn't stop moving until we were all behind cover. Last thing I remember before passing out was his face and him saying, "Nobody dies today, brother. Nobody dies today." Jack's voice caught, and he didn't try to hide it. I woke up in a hospital in Da Nang 3 days later. They told me the corporal made it, that he'd been medevaced out, that I should write down his name because the man had saved my life, and maybe someday I'd get to say thank you. Did you? Maggie's voice was soft. Did you get to say thank you? Once, 1995, I'd started my business, made some money, wanted to give back. Set up a community service award, asked veterans groups to nominate someone who exemplified service. They nominated your husband. I gave him the award at a ceremony downtown, shook his hand, told him I was the Marine he pulled out of Firebase Charlie. Jack smiled at the memory, small and sad. He didn't remember me. Said he'd pulled out a lot of people, that it was all just one long day that lasted 13 months. But he accepted the award, and you were there standing beside him in a blue dress, and he looked at you like you were the only real thing in a world made of smoke. Maggie remembered the ceremony. Remembered Henry in his only suit, uncomfortable with attention, wanting to be anywhere else. Remembered how he'd given the award to the diner afterward, insisted it belonged there on the wall where everyone could see it, because it wasn't just his award, it was the neighborhood's. She'd put it in the trophy case beside his military medals and their wedding photo, and it had stayed there for 29 years until last month, when she'd had to sell it to pay for supplies. She didn't tell Jack that. Some failures were too personal to share. After that ceremony, Jack continued, I tried to stay in touch, sent cards at Christmas, checked in occasionally, but life happens, years pass, and then someone tells me Henry Hayes died in 2019. Construction accident. Saved another man's life doing it. His hands clenched into fists on his knees, and I thought, of course he did. That's who he was. That's what he did, saved people. The automatic doors whispered open, and a doctor emerged. Scrubs wrinkled exhaustion, making her look older than she probably was. Her eyes scanned the waiting room and landed on Jack. Family of Daniel Morrison. Jack stood, the other 8 bikers rising with him like they were one organism. That's us. The doctor approached her, expression carefully neutral, in the way of medical professionals who've learned that faces lie to patients and truth should be delivered in words. He's stable. The wound was deep but clean, no arterial damage. We've given him antibiotics for the infection, fluids for the shock. He was hypothermic when you brought him in, core temperature was too low, but we've warmed him and he's responding well. Jack's entire body sagged with relief. Can we see him? One at a time. He's sedated, probably won't wake for a few hours. The doctor looked at Maggie, something softening in her professional mask. Are you family? Jack answered before Maggie could. She's family. She saved his life. The doctor nodded, accepting this with the weary wisdom of someone who'd learned that family was defined by who showed up when it mattered, not by whose DNA matched. You can go in, room 412, but he needs rest, so keep it brief. Maggie followed Jack through corridors that smelled like antiseptic and despair, and the particular staleness of buildings that never sleep. They found room 412 and turbated to find Danny in the kind of sleep that looks like death's distant cousin, his face pale against hospital white linens, monitors beeping reassurance and electronic voices. Jack stood beside the bed, his hand finding Danny's, holding it with the careful tenderness of men who'd learned that strength means knowing when to be gentle. He didn't speak, just stood there, and Maggie saw in his face something that explained everything. The desperate ride through the storm, the pleading at her door, the gratitude that had transcended situation and circumstance. This wasn't just another biker. This was Jack Morrison's son. The understanding hit her with physical force. Daniel Morrison, Jack's boy, saved twice now, once from whatever had put him on that road in a storm, and once from bleeding out in a diner booth while his father watched helpless. She thought about Henry, about how he would have felt if they'd had children, if those children had been in danger, if some stranger had opened a door and offered help when hope was running out. She thought about the debt Jack carried, the one from Firebase Charlie, and how that debt must feel doubled now, compounded by 50 years of interest in this fresh salvation. Jack looked at her across Danny's sleeping form. His voice was rough with exhaustion and emotion. Ma'am, I owe you more than I can ever repay. Maggie shook her head. You don't owe me anything, honey. I just did what anybody would do. That's where you're wrong. Jack's voice carried absolute certainty. Most people would have seen 9 men in leather and called the police. Most people would have locked their doors and convinced themselves it was self-preservation. You saw 9 men in trouble and opened your door. That's not what anybody would do. That's what exceptional people do. He reached into his jacket. Maggie tensed for just a heartbeat before relaxing and pulled out a thick roll of bills. Her heart sank even as she recognized the gesture for what it was. Payment settlement, the clearing of accounts in the only currency Jack knew how to offer. He held it out. This is for you, for the food, for staying with Danny, for everything. Maggie didn't need to count it to know it was more money than she'd made in the last 3 months. Money that could pay her electric bill, buy groceries, maybe even make a dent in the rent. Money that could keep Maggie's place open for another month, maybe two, could push back the deadline on dissolution and failure by precious increments. She pushed it back toward Jack without hesitation. I don't want your money, ma'am. I said I don't want it. You keep that for Danny's medical bills. Lord knows hospital care ain't cheap. The other bikers who'd crowded into the doorway exchanged glances. They weren't used to people refusing money, especially people who clearly needed it. Jack's expression cycled through confusion and respect and something approaching awe. Ma'am, you don't understand. I owe you. You don't owe me anything. Maggie's voice was firm, the same voice she'd used with Henry when he tried to go to work with broken ribs. The same voice that had convinced 100 kids over the years that they were worth more than their circumstances suggested. You were in trouble. I helped. That's what decent people do. That's what Henry would have wanted me to do. Jack tried a different approach. At least let us pay for the food. Food was leftovers anyway. Would have gone bad if nobody ate it. The coffee I was going to throw out at closing time. Another biker massive with arms like telephone poles tried. Ma'am, we know you're struggling. We saw the bills on your counter, the out-of-order signs on your tables. Please let us help. Maggie's spine stiffened, pride flaring hot in her chest. My business troubles are my business, sugar, not yours. Danny's eyes fluttered open, consciousness returning in increments. His gaze was unfocused at first, wandering around the room before settling on Maggie's face. Something flickered in his expression, recognition mixing with confusion, like he was trying to solve an equation that had too many variables. His voice came out as a whisper, Ma'am, can I talk to you for a minute? Maggie moved to his bedside immediately, her hand finding his forehead in the automatic gesture of checking for fever, for wellness, for all the things grandmothers check, even when monitors can tell you the same information with more precision. What do you need, baby? Danny's hand moved to his throat, fingers fumbling with a silver chain that had survived the crash and the ride and everything that followed. He unclasped it with difficulty, his movements slow and imprecise, and pressed it into Maggie's palm. It was a simple cross pendant, worn smooth by years of skin and sweat, and the kind of contact that turns metal into memory. Nothing fancy, just silver gone gray, with age hanging from a chain that had been repaired more than once. Danny's voice was weak but clear. My grandmother gave me this when I was little. She passed away when I was 13. His hand closed around hers, sealing her fingers around the pendant. His voice caught tangled on emotion and medication and memory. She was a lot like you, always helping people, always putting others first. Danny, I can't take this. This was your grandmother's, and now it's yours. His eyes were wet, not quite crying, but close. She would have liked you a lot. Maggie fastened the chain around her neck, and the cross settled against her chest, warm from Danny's skin, carrying weight beyond its mass. She felt it there against her heartbeat, and thought about chains of kindness, about how what we give away sometimes returns, transformed into something we needed more than what we surrendered. Jack pulled out a business card, plain white with expensive paper stock. Just a phone number embossed in simple black letters. He pressed it into her tin. Ma'am, if you ever need anything, and I mean anything, you call this number. His eyes held hers with an intensity that felt like an oath, like a promise made before witnesses. Day or night, doesn't matter when, you call and I'll answer. Maggie took the card, studied it. The paper felt expensive, the kind successful businesses use. Strange for a motorcycle club, but then everything about tonight had been strange, had been full of contradictions between appearance and reality. What kind of business are you in, Jack? He smiled slightly, something evasive entering his expression. Oh, we got our hands in a lot of things. Import, export, manufacturing. Little bit of everything. It was a non-answer, but Maggie didn't press. These men had been nothing but respectful. She'd give them the same courtesy, let them keep their secrets, as long as those secrets didn't threaten anyone. Well, Jack Morrison, you take care of that boy, and you boys ride safe out there. Yes, ma'am, we will. One by one, the bikers approached Maggie. Each removed his helmet and nodded with the kind of respect soldiers show superior officers, the kind of acknowledgement that transcends hierarchy and lands somewhere closer to recognition of character. Thank you, ma'am. Much obliged. You're a saint, Mama Maggie. They filed out of the hospital room, leaving Maggie alone with Danny for a few more minutes. She looked at this young man who'd appeared in her life via storm and emergency, who'd pressed his grandmother's cross into her palm, like passing a torch, who was watching her now, with eyes that held something she couldn't quite identify. You got good friends, she told him. Danny's smile was weak but genuine. Yeah, they're like family. We all look out for each other. Family's important, even when it's not blood family. Yes, ma'am, that's something I learned a long time ago. There was something in the way he said it, some weight to the words that suggested history that made Maggie think he was referencing something specific, some lesson that had cost him to learn. But before she could examine the thought, a nurse appeared to check vitals and adjust medication. And the moment passed. Maggie kissed Danny's forehead the way she'd done for dozens of neighborhood kids over 40 years. The gesture so automatic she didn't think about it until afterward, didn't think about how strange it was to kiss a stranger's forehead, except he didn't feel like a stranger. Felt like someone she'd known in a past life or a future one, someone connected to her by threads she couldn't see but could somehow feel. You heal up good, Danny, and don't you go riding in any more storms. Yes, ma'am. Thank you for everything. Maggie walked out of Memphis General into morning sunlight that had finally broken through the clouds. The storm had passed, leaving Memphis washed clean and wounded tree branches down standing water glittering in low spots, the city looking like it had been in a fight and survived, though not unscathed. She touched the cross pendant at her throat, warm against her skin, and felt good about what she'd done. Proud even. She'd helped people, really helped them. For once her kindness had made a difference that you could see, that you could measure in a young man's continued breathing. She had no idea that her act of kindness was about to cost her everything she had left. But she also had no idea that it was about to give her more than she'd ever dreamed possible. For now, in this moment, standing in the parking lot of Memphis General, as the sun climbed over Arkansas and painted the Mississippi gold, Margaret Hayes felt like maybe Henry was watching over her after all. Maybe all those years of feeding people who couldn't pay, of keeping her doors open when economics said close them, of choosing kindness over survival. Maybe all of it meant something. Maybe the universe kept accounts and eventually paid what it owed. She was about to learn that the universe did keep accounts. She just couldn't have guessed how complicated the ledger would turn out to be. Maggie drove back to the diner Monday morning with her windows down despite the autumn chill, letting October air carry away the hospital smell that had soaked into her clothes and hair and skin. The storm had scrubbed Memphis clean in that way storms do, washing away summer's last desperate heat and leaving behind air so crisp it hurt to breathe deep. She felt lighter than she had in months, years maybe. She'd helped people, really helped them. Made a difference that you could measure in continued heartbeats and steady breathing. That feeling lasted until noon. Chen cornered her outside Kim's grocery, where Maggie had stopped to buy day-old bread at half price, because fresh bread was for people whose bank accounts had commas. Mrs. Chen was 78, had lived on Elm Street since 1962, and had never met a piece of information she didn't feel morally obligated to share with everyone within 3 blocks. Her voice carried across the parking lot. Maggie, honey, I saw those motorcycles at your place Saturday night. Maggie shifted her grocery bag, generic brands, nothing fresh, the kind of shopping that happens when you're measuring your life in dollars, not meals. Just people who needed help during the storm, Mrs. Chen. But Maggie, Mrs. Chen moved closer, dropped her voice to what she probably thought was a whisper, but carried like a stage actor projecting to the back row. You know what kind of people they were, don't you? Something cold settled in Maggie's stomach. They were people in trouble. My Herald got an email this morning, anonymous, with news articles attached. Mrs. Chen pulled out her phone, fingers clumsy on the screen, found what she was looking for, and thrust it toward Maggie. About biker gangs, about drug trafficking and violence, and Maggie looked at the screen. News articles about motorcycle clubs, police records, mugshots of men in leather. The dates were wrong, the names were wrong, but someone had photoshopped them to look current, to look local. Professional work, the kind that required skill and intent and resources. Mrs. Chen, these articles are not about the men who were at my diner. But how do you know they all look the same, these biker types, all that leather and those tattoos? Harold says we need to be careful, says the neighborhood isn't safe if people like that are hanging around. Maggie handed the phone back. The neighborhood has been safe for 40 years because we look out for each other. That hasn't changed. She walked away before Mrs. Chen could respond, but the damage was already spreading. She could feel it in the way people watched her cross the parking lot, in the way conversations stopped, when she passed, in the weight of judgment that accumulates in small communities when someone steps outside the acceptable boundaries of behavior. By Tuesday afternoon, the breakfast crowd had shrunk to half its normal size. Mr. Patterson still came loyal as sunrise, shuffling through the door at 6:15 like he'd done every morning for the past 17 years. But Lisa didn't bring her twins. The construction workers from the Riverside project, who usually grabbed lunch, looked nervous. Passing her windows, walked faster, found somewhere else to eat. Maggie stood behind the counter and watched potential customers approach her door, watched them read something in the windows or remember something they'd heard, watched them change their minds and hurry past. Each rejection was a small cut, the kind that doesn't bleed much individually, but added together can drain you dry. She served Mr. Patterson his coffee and toast, charged him 75 cents like always, and tried not to think about the math. $12 revenue this morning. The coffee alone had cost her $8. Mr. Patterson looked around the empty diner. Where is everybody? People are busy, I guess. Maggie. His voice was gentle but firm, the tone you use with someone you care about when you need them to hear something they don't want to know. What's going on? She told him about Saturday night, about the storm and the injured man and the ride through flooded streets. Mr. Patterson listened without interrupting, his weathered hands wrapped around coffee that was going cold while she talked. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then you did the right thing. I know I did. But people are scared, and scared people don't think straight. He pushed his coffee cup toward her for a refill she gave without charging. They hear biker gang and stop listening. Doesn't matter that you saved a life. Doesn't matter that those men were respectful. Fear's got its own logic. So what do I do? Mr. Patterson's smile was sad. You keep being who you are. Eventually people remember. Eventually they come back. He paused, but eventually might take a while. Wednesday brought 3 customers all day. Maggie sat behind the counter doing math that refused to balance no matter how many times she recalculated. Revenue $43. Expenses $67 for supplies she'd bought before realizing nobody was coming. She was bleeding money faster than Danny had bled on her booth Saturday night. Thursday, the first anonymous note appeared, slipped under the door during the night. Block letters on cheap paper, drug dealers not welcome in this neighborhood. Maggie held it with shaking hands, read it 3 times like repetition might change the words. No signature, no specific threat, just the suggestion of violence wrapped in paper and anonymity. She thought about calling the police, couldn't imagine what she'd say. Someone left me a note. Someone thinks I'm involved with drugs because I helped an injured man. She threw it away, tried to forget it, found herself pulling it back out of the trash an hour later to read again. The words hadn't changed. Friday brought the health inspector. He arrived at 10 a.m. with a clipboard and an expression that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. His name was Rodriguez, had been doing inspections in Memphis for 15 years, had never once found significant violations at Maggie's place because Maggie ran her kitchen the way Henry had taught her, clean, organized, respectful of the fact that food safety was the contract between cook and customer. But today Rodriguez went through her kitchen like he was searching for bodies. Checked temperatures on her walk-in cooler, found it 2 degrees off standard. Examined the grout between floor tiles in the storage area, found cracking that had been there since 1987. Tested her grease trap, declared it needed servicing, despite the fact that she'd had it serviced in August. He wrote everything down with mechanical precision, no wasted words, no eye contact. When he finished, he handed her a citation printed on official paper that made it real in a way that words couldn't. $500 in fines, 30 days, to correct all violations. I've never had problems before, Maggie said, and hated how small her voice sounded, how much like pleading. Rodriguez's face twitched with something that might have been sympathy. Just doing my job, ma'am. Who called in the complaint? Anonymous tip line, that's all I know. He moved toward the door, stopped with his hand on the handle. Between you and me, this complaint had weight behind it. Pressure from somewhere. That's not normal. He met her eyes finally. Document everything. This doesn't smell right. After he left, Maggie stood in her empty diner holding a citation that might as well have been a death certificate. $500 she didn't have to fix violations that had been acceptable for 30 years. She could fight it, could appeal, could hire a lawyer. She couldn't afford to argue about grout and temperature readings while her savings evaporated and her customers stayed away. Or she could pay the fine and make the corrections and hope that eventually people forgot about Saturday night, forgot about bikers and storms and the way fear turns neighbors into strangers. She looked at Henry's photograph on the wall. Baby, I don't know what to do. Henry didn't answer, had stopped answering in 2019 when a scaffold collapsed and he'd pushed a young worker to safety and taken the fall himself. But she could imagine what he'd say. Keep fighting. Don't let them break you. You've got more strength than you know. The problem with strength was it didn't pay bills. Saturday morning, she arrived to find spray paint across her front window. 2 words in red that looked black in certain light, biker trash. Maggie stood in the parking lot as the sun climbed over the buildings to the east, painting the Mississippi gold in the distance. She watched light hit the spray paint and transform it from vandalism into art of a sort, the kind of art that speaks to everything humans do to each other when fear replaces thought. She'd bought this building with Henry in 1984, spent every penny they'd saved over 10 years of construction jobs and diner shifts in the kind of poverty that makes you strong or breaks you depending on what you're made of. They'd painted it themselves, hung the sign themselves, installed the booths with their own hands because contractors cost money, and money was what you were trying to earn, not spend. For 40 years, this building had been her home more than the apartment she slept in. For 40 years, she'd opened these doors and fed people who needed feeding and created a space where everyone belonged, regardless of what their bank accounts said about their worth. For 40 years, she'd believed that kindness mattered, that what you put into the world came back multiplied. Now someone had reduced all that to 2 words in spray paint that wouldn't come off no matter how hard she scrubbed. She tried anyway, spent 2 hours with solvent and rags, and the kind of determination that looks like stubbornness from the outside, but feels like survival from the inside. The paint smeared, faded to pink, ghosts refused to disappear completely. She gave up when her arms started shaking, when the chemical smell made her dizzy, when she finally accepted that some stains go too deep for solvent to reach. She opened the diner with the stains still visible, a brand marking her as someone who'd crossed lines that good people don't cross. 0 customers came, $0 in the register. She sat behind the counter and watched the clock measure out time in increments that felt like bleeding. By Monday of the second week, strange things were happening. A flower delivery arrived Tuesday afternoon. Beautiful arrangement, expensive, the kind that costs what Maggie made in a good week. No card, just a note in elegant script in gratitude. Maggie signed for them because the delivery driver insisted they'd been paid for, and refusing seemed more complicated than accepting. But she stared at those flowers like they might contain surveillance devices, like they were proof of something she couldn't articulate but could feel in her bones. Who sent flowers? What were they grateful for? Was this payment for Saturday night despite her refusing money? Was this something else, something that connected to the spray paint and the anonymous notes and the way her world was slowly being dismantled by forces she couldn't see? She put them on the counter and watched them slowly die over the next week, their beauty collapsing into decay petals falling like accusations. Wednesday brought premium coffee beans delivered in bags that had labels suggesting they cost more than Maggie's monthly rent. The delivery driver knew nothing paid online. Sorry, lady, just doing my job. She accepted them because rejecting seemed paranoid, but paranoia was starting to feel like appropriate response to circumstances. The phone call started Thursday. 3 times that day, her landline rang, and when she answered, voices asked for Captain or the Memphis location. And when she said wrong number, they hung up fast, too fast, the kind of fast that suggested they'd confirmed something rather than reached a dead end. Friday, a black sedan appeared across from her diner. Different people inside at different times, but same car, same careful attention to her building. Once she saw someone with a camera taking the photos, not of the building, but of her through the window. She marched outside, ready to confront them, but the car sped away before she reached the curb. By Saturday night, Maggie was afraid in a way she hadn't been since those first months after Henry died, when loneliness felt like drowning, and every day meant waking to the absence of someone who'd been the North Star by which she'd navigated 47 years. This was different fear, though not existential, but immediate. Someone was watching her. Someone was orchestrating something. The harassment wasn't random, it was coordinated, professional funded. She pulled out Jack Morrison's business card, the one with just a phone number embossed on expensive paper. Stared at it for an hour before finally dialing. The phone rang 4 times. She was ready to hang up when it clicked to voicemail. You've reached Morrison Enterprises. Please leave a detailed message and someone will return your call within 24 hours. Morrison Enterprises, not Jack's Garage or Memphis Riders or whatever she'd half expected. Enterprises. The word suggested organization infrastructure, the kind of business that has office staff and return call policies and structures that don't collapse when the boss is unavailable. She hung up without leaving a message, unsettled by evidence that contradicted her assumptions. Bikers ran motorcycle clubs, not enterprises. They lived on the margins, not in the world of voicemail systems and 24-hour response protocols. Unless they weren't just bikers. Sunday, she couldn't take the isolation anymore. After services at First Baptist, where people smiled but didn't quite meet her eyes, where conversation died when she approached, where 60 years of attendance counted for less than one night of helping the wrong people, she drove to the public library on Poplar Avenue. The library computers were free, the internet access unlimited, and Maggie had enough technological literacy to navigate Google, even if she'd never owned a computer herself. She typed Morrison Enterprises into the search bar and watched the screen populate with results that made her reconsider everything she thought she knew. Morrison Manufacturing, $500 million in annual revenue. Headquarters in Nashville, manufacturing plants in 6 states. Motorcycle and automotive parts. Precision engineering, contracts with major manufacturers from Ford to Harley-Davidson. Jack Morrison, CEO, age 58, Purple Heart recipient, Vietnam veteran, named one of Tennessee's top 50 entrepreneurs 3 years running. Graduated University of Tennessee, 1976 on the GI Bill MBA from Vanderbilt, 1980, built Morrison Enterprises from a single garage into a national manufacturing powerhouse. The photos showed a different Jack Morrison than the one who'd stood in her diner dripping rainwater and begging for help. This Jack wore expensive suits and shook hands with governors. This Jack gave speeches at business conferences and sat on boards of charitable foundations. This Jack looked like success measured in quarterly reports and stock valuations. But it was the same face, same eyes, same bearing that suggested military training never quite leaves even when the uniform comes off decades ago. She searched Daniel Morrison and found him 2 VP of Operations Morrison Industries. Age 29 MBA from Vanderbilt following his father's path, described in business journals as the heir apparent to a manufacturing empire built on precision and integrity. Photos showed him clean-cut in expensive suits. Nothing like the bleeding man who'd pressed his grandmother's cross into her palm. But the eyes were the same. Those striking blue eyes that had looked at her in the hospital with something that felt like recognition. She clicked through to Morrison's Brotherhood Riders, found them on social media, where apparently even biker groups maintain professional pages now. Photos from last month showed Jack and 8 other men on motorcycles captioned reading, "Monthly Veterans Ride, brothers who serve together, ride together." The comments underneath were revealing, "Thank you for your service." And great seeing you give back to community and Morrison Industries' best employer in Tennessee. These weren't outlaws. They were decorated veterans who rode motorcycles for recreation and ran successful businesses the other 6 days of the week. They were respectable in ways that mattered to people who cared about such things, pillars of communities they could have abandoned for places where their money would buy more square footage and fewer complications. Maggie sat back in her library chair recalibrating. She'd assumed Hell's Angels meant criminals, meant danger, meant people who lived outside the rules. But these men had built the rules, had succeeded so thoroughly that they got to decide which rules mattered and which ones could be ignored. So why had they come to her diner looking desperate? Why had Jack called himself captain instead of CEO? Why had they hidden who they were, played along with her assumptions about motorcycle gangs and danger? And why was someone now trying to destroy her business using tactics that required resources she couldn't match? She thought about the health inspector who'd found violations that hadn't mattered before, about the anonymous emails to her neighbors full of forged articles, about the black sedan that watched and documented but never approached, about flowers and coffee and phone calls that suggested coordination, organization, intent. Someone was applying pressure, someone with resources, someone who wanted her gone badly enough to wage a campaign of incremental destruction. But who and why the third week brought answers she didn't want. Monday morning, Lisa finally came to the diner. Not with her twins, just herself, and the guilt on her face told Maggie everything before she said a word. I can't bring the kids here anymore. Lisa wouldn't meet her eyes, stared at the counter like confession required, avoiding the gaze of the confessor. I'm sorry, Maggie. I'm so sorry. Baby, why not? I got a visit from Child Services. Lisa's voice broke. Friday, anonymous complaint saying I was letting my kids hang around drug dealers and criminals. They interviewed the twins at school, Maggie. Do you know how scared they were? Strange adults pulling them out of class, asking if they'd seen drugs, if they felt safe. The words hit like physical blows. Maggie reached for Lisa's hand, but Lisa pulled back, and that hurt worse than anything that had come before. The investigator cleared me, said it was obviously false reporting. But she also said, Lisa's hands twisted together, knuckles white with pressure. She said I should be more careful about who I associate with, said even the appearance of risk could be grounds for concern if another complaint came in. Lisa, there's no risk. Those men were just... I know, Lisa's voice rose sharp with frustration and fear. I know you were helping someone. I believe you. But I can't risk losing my babies, Maggie. They're all I have. Since David died, they're everything. David, Lisa's husband, killed by an IED outside Fallujah in 2007. Maggie had been at the funeral, had held Lisa while she sobbed, had helped with the twins when Lisa couldn't get out of bed for weeks after. Had been feeding this family at a loss for 8 years because that's what you did for people who'd sacrificed everything. Now that sacrifice was being weaponized. Someone had looked at Lisa's vulnerability and found the exact pressure point to exploit. I understand, Maggie said, and meant it even as her heart broke. You do what you need to protect your children. Lisa left without ordering, without even sitting down, and Maggie watched her go, knowing that she'd just lost more than a customer. She'd lost someone she'd helped raise from widow to survivor, to the kind of mother who works 3 jobs and still makes time for homework and bedtime stories. Tuesday, the construction workers' foreman finally explained why his crew had stopped coming. Carlos Martinez had been eating lunch at Maggie's place for 7 years, had brought his whole crew with him, 15 men who spent their days building Memphis brick by brick and needed the kind of calories Maggie served without pretension or unnecessary expense. He came alone at 2 p.m. after the lunch rush that no longer existed, his work boots leaving red clay on her floor. Maggie, I need to tell you something. She poured him coffee without asking, the ritual so automatic her hands knew the movements before her brain engaged. I'm listening. We got a contract warning from Hutchins Development. Carlos wrapped his hands around the coffee cup like he needed something to hold on to. They're the developers on the Madison Street project. Threatened to pull our permits, withhold payment, blacklist us with the city if we keep patronizing establishments with criminal ties. Criminal ties. Maggie repeated the words like they might make sense in a different order. Carlos, you know I'm not. I know, of course I know, but Maggie... His voice carried the weight of impossible choices. It's 10 jobs, 10 families, men with mortgages and kids in school and medical bills. I can't lose that contract. Can't risk their livelihoods because... He stopped, started over. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. After he left, Maggie looked up Hutchins Development on her phone, the old smartphone Lisa had given her last Christmas that she barely knew how to use beyond basic searches. The website was slick, professional, full of renderings of luxury developments and testimonials from satisfied clients. CEO Victor Hutchins, age 51, second-generation developer, following his father Gerald Hutchins into the family business, specializing in urban revitalization and upscale commercial development. She clicked through to current projects and founded Elm Street Revitalization, a $50 million development promising luxury condos, high-end retail, a complete transformation of 6 blocks from working-class neighborhood to something that would price out everyone who currently lived there. The rendering showed her block completely demolished, replaced by glass and steel that looked like it belonged in Manhattan, not Memphis. Pending final property acquisition, read the caption under the image. Final property acquisition. Her lease, the one Victor Hutchins had offered to buy 3 times offers she'd refused because selling meant surrendering everything she and Henry had built. Selling meant admitting defeat, meant accepting that love and stubbornness and 40 years of 5 a.m. wake-ups weren't enough against the arithmetic of gentrification. Now she understood. Victor Hutchins wanted her block for a development worth $50 million. Her diner was the final holdout, the one property he couldn't buy or intimidate or demolish. So he'd found her vulnerabilities and exploited them with the kind of professional precision that required resources she couldn't match. The bikers had been opportunity, not cause. Her helping them gave Victor the weapon he needed, a narrative about criminal associations that could be deployed to pressure her neighbors, her suppliers, anyone whose cooperation she needed to survive. Wednesday afternoon, she walked into Hutchins Development Corporation with fury propelling her forward and fear whispering she should turn back. The building was 30 stories of glass downtown, the kind of place where the elevator probably cost more than her annual revenue. Security tried to stop her at the lobby. "I need to see Victor Hutchins." The guard looked her up and down, dismissed her as non-threat in 3 seconds of assessment. "Do you have an appointment?" "Tell him Maggie Hayes is here about attempted murder." She said it loud enough that everyone in the lobby stopped, turned, watched. "Tell him if he doesn't see me, next conversation is with police." The threat was empty. She had no proof, no evidence beyond pattern and intuition, but it got her upstairs. Victor Hutchins's office occupied the southwest corner of the 30th floor, windows offering panoramic views of Memphis sprawling toward Arkansas. The furniture was expensive in that understated way that required you to know what you were looking at to understand its cost. Art on the walls that was probably original, probably worth more than Maggie's building. Victor stood as she entered, extending his hand with the smile of someone who'd learned that charm was cheaper than honesty. He was handsome in that careful way of men who paid attention to such things. His suit probably cost what Maggie made in a good month, his hair styled with product that smelled like money and confidence. "Ms. Hayes, what an unexpected pleasure." Maggie ignored the offered hand. "Then cut the act. I know about Danny Morrison's break line." The smile didn't waver, but something behind his eyes recalculated. "I have no idea what you're talking about. You tried to kill a young man to force me out of my diner." "That's quite an accusation." His voice stayed pleasant but gained an edge. "Do you have proof? Because without proof, that's slander. I could sue you for everything you have." He paused for effect, which admittedly isn't much. The words were designed to wound, delivered with the casual cruelty of someone who'd learned that power meant never worrying about consequences. Maggie felt them land, felt them cut, refused to show the bleeding. Why do all this?" Victor walked to his windows, looked out over the city like he owned it. Maybe he did own enough of it that the distinction didn't matter. "Ms. Hayes, let me be frank with you. This city is changing. Your neighborhood sits on prime real estate near the river, near downtown, near everything that makes Memphis valuable. My development will bring jobs, growth, prosperity, tax revenue for the city, opportunities for hundreds of workers, and displace 200 families who've lived there for generations. Collateral damage." He turned backlit by windows so she couldn't see his expression clearly, just his silhouette against the glass, and spoke. "Progress requires sacrifice. Your little diner is standing in the way of a $50 million project. Jobs for hundreds. Economic development the city desperately needs. Versus your, what, charity operation that barely breaks even. That charity operation feeds people who need feeding. Very noble, very admirable. But Ms. Hayes," he moved closer and she could see his face now, see the absolute certainty that he was right, that his vision was the only vision that mattered. "The world is math. 50 million in development versus your annual revenue of what, 30,000? The equation isn't complicated." He pulled a folder from his desk, extracted papers that looked official and threatening simultaneously. "Here's my final offer, $100,000 for your lease. Cash. Walk away with dignity and enough money to retire comfortably." I don't want your money. Then you'll get nothing. His voice hardened, the charm evaporating like it had never been real. I'll keep applying pressure until you break. Everyone breaks, Ms. Hayes, everyone. Your customers will stay away. Your suppliers will refuse delivery. Your landlord will evict you. I have resources you can't imagine, and I'll use every single one until you're gone. Maggie stood and walked to the door, stopped with her hand on the handle. My husband once told me something. He said, the measure of a man isn't what he takes, it's what he's willing to defend. I'm defending my home, my neighborhood, my people. What are you defending, Mr. Hutchins? Your bank account. She walked out before he could answer, rode the elevator down 30 floors with her heart hammering and her hands shaking, and the knowledge that she'd just made an enemy who had the power to destroy her, while she had nothing but stubbornness, and the fading memory of a man who'd taught her that some things were worth fighting for, even when the fight was hopeless. The week after her confrontation with Victor Hutchins, 3 disasters arrived in simultaneous waves like a storm hitting from 3 directions at once. Tuesday morning, her electric company shut off power at 8 a.m. exactly. She called immediately, was informed by a bored voice reading from a script that her account was 90 days past due, and per company policy, disconnection was automatic at 91 days. I've been a customer for 40 years. Yes, ma'am, I see that in your file. Unfortunately, our policies don't allow exceptions based on payment history. The voice was professionally sympathetic, which somehow made it worse. To restore service, you'll need to pay your outstanding balance plus a reconnection fee. Total due is $960. Maggie hung up and sat in her darkening diner watching the sun climb through her windows and knowing that without power, she had no refrigeration, no cooking equipment, no coffee, no ability to serve the customers who weren't coming anyway. She had maybe 6 hours before everything in her walk-in cooler spoiled, before she had to throw away $300 worth of food she couldn't afford to replace. At noon, the fire marshal arrived for an inspection she hadn't known was scheduled. He was thorough, professional, and apologetic in that way that meant he was doing something he didn't feel good about, but would do anyway because duty trumped discomfort. He shut down her kitchen on the grounds that her fire suppression system was outdated, had been outdated for years, apparently needed to be upgraded to current code before she could legally operate. This is going to cost $15,000, Maggie said after he explained what needed to be done. That's probably accurate, yes, ma'am. I don't have $15,000. Then you'll need to remain closed until you can secure financing or find alternative arrangements. He handed her the official closure notice, stamped with seals that made it real. I'm sorry, Ms. Hayes, I really am. At 4 p.m., her bank called. Not the local branch where she'd banked since 1984, where the tellers knew her name and the manager attended her church, but some centralized customer service center where her account was just a number in a database. They were calling existing small business loans per new lending criteria. Her balance of $8,000 was due immediately. I've been paying on time for 15 years. Yes, ma'am, I show your payment history has been excellent. Unfortunately, due to recent risk assessment analysis, your business no longer qualifies under our current lending standards. You have 14 days to pay the balance in full or will be forced to initiate collections proceedings. Maggie hung up and did the math that refused to balance no matter how many different ways she approached it. Total debts due immediately $32,290. Assets available $73 in checking. The gap was so large, it felt abstract, like trying to comprehend the distance to the moon. You could measure it, but couldn't really imagine crossing it. She walked through her dark diner and touched each booth, each picture of Henry, each surface worn smooth by 40 years of elbows and coffee cups and conversations between people who'd found in this space something they couldn't find anywhere else. This building had been the physical proof that love mattered, that kindness was currency, that held value, that you could build something meaningful if you just kept showing up every morning before dawn and putting in the work even when nothing suggested the work would ever pay enough to be called success. Now someone was dismantling it with the casual efficiency of a demolition crew clearing land for new construction. Victor Hutchins was erasing her exactly the way his rendering showed her block erased, replaced by something shinier and more profitable, and utterly devoid of the connections that made a neighborhood more than just coordinates on a map. Mr. Patterson found her sitting in the dark at 5 p.m. doors, still unlocked, even though she had no customers and no power and no real reason to be open. He shuffled in with his cane and his VFW cap and the permanent stoop of 87 years spent on Earth, 46 of them carrying shrapnel from the Battle of the Bulge in his hip and spine. He saw her face and understood immediately. How bad, she told him. All of it. The debts and the disasters and the systematic destruction of everything she'd built. Her voice stayed steady until she got to the part about losing Henry's physical artifacts, about how the trophies and medals she'd sold last month meant she had no physical proof he'd existed beyond photographs and memories that would die with her. It's not about the money, Mr. Patterson. It's about losing the last piece of him I have, Mr. Patterson reached into his pockets with trembling fingers and pulled out everything he carried, $3.47 in quarters and dimes and nickels that represented his monthly discretionary income after Social Security paid rent and medicine and the other non-negotiable expenses of survival at 87. It's all I have, but you take it. I can't. Maggie Hayes, you've been feeding I at a loss for 17 years. You've never once made me feel like charity, even though we both know that's what it is. You take this money. His voice broke. Let an old man keep his dignity by helping when he finally can. She took it not because she needed $3.47, but because refusing would have broken something between them that was more valuable than money. She accepted it the way you accept communion, understanding that the substance matters less than what it represents. After Mr. Patterson left, she sat alone in the darkening diner and thought about surrender, about calling Victor Hutchins and accepting his offer. Walking away with $100,000 that would let her live comfortably, if modestly, for her remaining years. Giving up the fight because some fights can't be won by wanting to win them badly enough. Henry's voice spoke in her memory, clear as if he were sitting beside her. Keep fighting. Don't let them break you. You've got more strength than you know. But Henry had died 5 years ago, and strength didn't pay electric bills or bank loans or fire suppression upgrades. Strength was what you told yourself mattered when nothing else did, when material reality had stripped away every practical reason to keep fighting and left you with nothing but the stories you believed about who you were. She pulled out Jack Morrison's business card again, the one with just a phone number embossed on expensive paper. Stared at it for an hour in the failing light while she wrestled with pride and desperation and the understanding that asking for help meant admitting she couldn't save herself. She dialed. This time when it went to voicemail, she left a message. Mr. Morrison, this is Maggie Hayes from the diner. I need help. I don't know who else to call. Her voice broke on the last word. She hung up and sat in the dark and waited for dawn or disaster or whatever came next, when you'd run out of options and prayers and the kind of stubbornness that had kept her going for 73 years. Thursday morning, a black sedan pulled up to her diner. Not the same one that had been watching her. At least she didn't think it was the same. They all looked identical to her, but close enough that her first instinct was to lock the doors and call police. She'd already learned couldn't help with threats that stayed carefully legal. A woman emerged, 40s professional suit, moving with the confident purpose of someone used to difficult conversations. She knocked on the locked door and held up identification that took Maggie 3 attempts to read through the dusty glass. Rachel Torres, Morrison Industries Security. Maggie unlocked the door because what else did she have to lose at this point? Ms. Hayes, I apologize for the surveillance you've noticed. Mr. Morrison asked us to ensure your safety after the incident with his son. Rachel's voice was professional, but warm, like she did this often enough to have developed a good bedside manner. We've been documenting the harassment you've experienced. We know about the health inspector, the fire marshal, the anonymous complaints. We know Victor Hutchins is behind all of it. Then why haven't you stopped him? Because until now, we weren't sure you'd accept our help. Mr. Morrison was very clear that you refused payment for helping Danny. He didn't want to force assistance. You didn't want... I left a message last night. I know. That's why I'm here. Rachel pulled out a tablet, showed Maggie documentation that looked official, and damning emails from Victor Hutchins to his staff coordinating the harassment campaign payments to Tony Marshall for security consulting. That lined up exactly with the night Danny's break line was cut, records of complaints filed to various city agencies using shell companies and anonymous tip lines. This is enough to destroy him, Rachel said. We can file criminal charges, sue, civilly make this public in ways that would end his development career. But, but what Rachel's face showed genuine conflict. Victor's father is Gerald Hutchins. He's 82 years old, retired from the business, but still lives off its success. If we destroy Victor, we destroy Gerald too. The shame, the scandal, the financial repercussions. Why would I care about Gerald Hutchins? Because Gerald Hutchins saved your husband's life in 1980. Oh, construction accident on the Riverside Plaza project. Beam was falling. Gerald pushed Henry. Clear took a broken arm. Doing it. It's the reason Gerald kept your rent low all these years. The reason he never forced you out, even when it would have been financially smart. He felt he owed Henry a debt. The words hit like discovering Henry had a whole life she'd never known about. Henry never told me. According to Gerald, Henry made him promise not to. Your husband didn't like being owed, apparently. Preferred to keep the ledger balanced. Rachel looked at her with something like sympathy. Mr. Morrison is leaving the choice to you. We can give you justice, destroy Victor, legally make him pay for everything he's done. Or we can offer you mercy, buy out your lease for enough money to settle all your debts, relocate you somewhere Victor can't reach, let him walk away without consequences. What does Jack want? Jack Morrison wants to honor the debt he owes your husband and the debt your husband owed Gerald. He wants to do the right thing, but he's leaving it to you to define what that means. Maggie looked around her dark diner at 40 years of her life contained in fixtures and booths and memories that would mean nothing to whoever bought this building next. She thought about Henry running into machine gun fire for someone he'd never met, about Gerald pushing Henry clear of falling debris and breaking his own arm, about debts that accumulated across decades and complicated attempts at simple justice. She thought about Victor Hutchins trying to kill Danny, trying to destroy her, trying to erase an entire neighborhood for $50 million and his own advancement. She thought about Lisa's twins being interrogated at school, about Mr. Patterson offering his last $3, about Carlos losing contracts that fed 10 families. She thought about what Henry would want and realized she already knew. Tell Mr. Morrison I'll meet with him, but I haven't decided anything yet. She looked at Rachel. And tell him I need to meet Gerald Hutchins first. I need to thank the man who saved my husband before I decide what mercy means. Gerald Hutchins lived in a house that surprised Maggie with its modesty. She'd expected something grand, something that matched the 30-story glass tower his son worked from, something that spoke to decades of successful development in a city that rewarded such success with square footage and proximity to the country club. Instead, she found herself standing on the porch of a brick ranch in Midtown, the kind of house union workers bought in 1968 when Memphis was still building itself into something the future might remember. The doorbell didn't work. She knocked and waited, listening to movement inside, slow footsteps that spoke of age or injury or both. The man who answered was 82 but looked older, bent by gravity and time, and whatever weight conscience carries when you've lived long enough to accumulate real regrets. His eyes found hers and something passed between them, recognition of a sort that transcends introduction. Mrs. Hayes, I've been expecting you. Mr. Hutchins, thank you for seeing me. Should have come sooner, should have come 36 years ago. He stepped back, gestured her inside. But cowardice is easier than honesty, and I've always taken the easier path when it was offered. The interior matched the exterior, modest, worn, lived in. Walls covered with construction photos spanning 4 decades, cruising buildings, and a Memphis skyline that had changed from low and sprawling to something that reached skyward with the desperate optimism of cities that have been counted out too many times. One photo drew her attention immediately. Gerald and Henry, 1985, both younger, both smiling, standing in front of what looked like scaffolding. Gerald saw her looking. That's the day he saved my life. They sat in his living room on furniture that had been expensive once and was now just comfortable, worn into the shape of bodies that had occupied it for decades. Gerald moved like someone managing pain, every motion calculated to minimize whatever was wrong with his hip or back, or the accumulated damage of a lifetime spent working jobs that broke men down incrementally. Jack Morrison told me you saved Henry, that you pulled him clear of falling debris. Gerald's face did something complicated, muscles working under skin that had learned to carry deception for so long that truth required visible effort. That's the story I told everyone, the official story, the one that went into the accident report, in the insurance claim, and the version that I've been living with for 36 years. He leaned forward, hands clasped between his knees, like a penitent preparing confession. The truth is your husband saved my life that day. The beam was falling toward me. Henry saw it, saw I was in the path and too slow to move. He pushed me clear. He was supposed to take the fall. Maggie felt something cold settle in her chest. What do you mean, supposed to? He pushed me, but he didn't fall with it. He rolled, got clear, survived without serious injury. I took credit because I was the foreman, because I was supposed to keep people safe, because if the truth came out that a worker had saved the boss instead of vice versa, it would have raised questions about site safety, about my competence, about whether I should have seen the risk before the beam started falling. His voice carried decades of accumulated guilt. So I lied, told everyone I'd saved Henry, kept him quiet with promises of job security and lower rent on that building he'd just bought. He went along with it because he had a new wife and a new business and couldn't afford to make enemies of the people who controlled construction contracts in this city. Why are you telling me this now? Because I'm dying, cancer, 6 months, maybe less. Gerald's hands trembled slightly, whether from age or emotion, Maggie couldn't tell. And because you deserve to know that your husband was even better than you thought. He didn't just save me physically. He protected my reputation, my career, let me live a lie that kept food on my table and respect in the eyes of people who mattered. He stood with difficulty, walked to a filing cabinet, extracted a folder, yellow with age. Inside were documents, the original accident report with notes in the margins, a letter in Henry's handwriting, dated 1985, photographs from the scene that showed angles contradicting the official story. I kept these, evidence of my cowardice. Thought maybe someday I'd find the courage to tell the truth. But courage is like muscle. If you don't use it, it atrophies. By the time I wanted to be honest, it was too late. The lie had become history, and history is harder to correct than the present. Maggie looked through the documents, seeing Henry's signature, seeing proof that the man she'd loved for 47 years had carried secrets she'd never suspected. It shouldn't have surprised her Vietnam had taught Henry how to carry weights silently, but somehow it did reveal dimensions to his character she'd thought she'd fully mapped. There's something else you need to know. Gerald's voice dropped. About Henry's death, the scaffold collapsed in 2019. Maggie looked up sharply. What about it? The equipment was faulty. I'd been cutting corners trying to maximize profits as I got closer to retirement. Henry filed a complaint 6 weeks before the accident. 3 pages detailing safety violations, equipment that needed replacement, protocols that were being ignored. I received it, read it, filed it away without acting. The words arrived like bullets, each one finding flesh. Then the collapse happened. Henry pushed that young worker to safety and took the fall himself. But Mrs. Hayes, Gerald's voice broke completely. He shouldn't have been in danger at all. That scaffold should have been replaced. Those protocols should have been enforced. Your husband died because I valued money over safety, because I ignored warnings from someone who'd saved my life and protected my reputation. Maggie couldn't breathe. Henry's death hadn't been random accident or unavoidable tragedy. It had been preventable. It had been the direct result of negligence, of greed, of one man's decision that profit mattered more than the lives of men who built things with their hands. Why are you telling me this? Because you're deciding what happens to my son. Because Victor learned everything wrong from me. He learned that money justifies any action, that other people are obstacles to be removed or resources to be exploited. That success is measured in dollars rather than character. I made him what he is, and now he's destroying you the same way I destroyed your husband. Vico, Gerald pulled out another document, handwritten on legal paper, notarized and official. This is my confession. Full documentation of the safety violations that killed Henry, my culpability, everything. If you want justice, you can take this to the police, to lawyers, to journalists. You can destroy me, destroy whatever legacy I've built. It won't bring Henry back, but it will be true, and truth has its own kind of value. He handed her the document with shaking hands. Or you can burn it. Let me die with my lies intact. Protect my son from consequences he's earned because his father set him on that path. His eyes met hers, red with tears he was too old to hide. I'm leaving the choice to you, Mrs. Hayes. Justice or mercy. I've had 36 years of mercy I didn't deserve. Maybe it's time for the other thing. Maggie sat holding proof of negligence that had killed her husband, holding the power to destroy the man responsible, holding the weight of a decision that felt too large for one person to carry. She thought about Henry on his deathbed, about his last words before the morphine took him beyond speech. Keep helping people, even the ones who don't deserve it, especially them. That's what separates us from the darkness. She thought about Victor Hutchins and his $50 million development, about Lisa's twins interrogated at school, about Mr. Patterson offering his last $3, about a community being erased because someone had decided its value could be measured in quarterly returns and future revenue projections. She thought about Jack Morrison and his life debt, about Danny pressing his grandmother's cross into her palm, about the chain of kindness and obligation that connected Firebase Charlie to this living room, where an old man waited for judgment he knew he deserved. I need to think about this. Maggie stood, the documents heavy in her hands. But Mr. Hutchins, I want you to understand something. My husband forgave you 36 years ago when he went along with your lie. He protected you because that's who he was. He didn't hold grudges, didn't believe in vengeance. Thought the point of surviving was to help other people survive too. She moved toward the door, stopped with her hand on the frame. So whatever I decide, it won't be about punishing you. It'll be about honoring him. And I'm not sure yet what honor requires. Outside Gerald's house, she sat in her car for an hour, unable to drive, unable to think past the roaring in her ears that felt like grief arriving 5 years late, like anger that had been stored under pressure finally finding release. Henry had been killed by negligence, by greed, by a man who'd valued his profit margin over the lives of workers who trusted him to maintain basic safety standards. And that man's son was now using the exact same calculus to erase her from existence. She could destroy them both, could take Gerald's confession to prosecutors, to journalists, to anyone who would listen, could make sure Victor Hutchins' name became synonymous with corruption and his father's death came wrapped in scandal and shame, could ensure that the development on Elm Street died with Victor's reputation, that justice was served hot and complete and satisfying in the way vengeance sometimes feels before you recognize it as poison. Or she could choose mercy, could burn the confession, could accept Jack Morrison's offer, whatever it turned out to be, could walk away and let the Hutchins family live with their guilt in private rather than public shame. She pulled out her phone, dialed the number Jack had given her. This time he answered on the second ring. Ms. Hayes, I've made my decision about Gerald, about Victor, about everything. When can we meet? Morrison Industries headquarters occupied a building in Nashville that looked like it had been designed by someone who believed success should be visible from orbit. Glass and steel, reaching 20 stories, the company name in letters that caught sunlight and threw it back like a challenge. Maggie stood in the parking lot feeling smaller than she had in Gerald's modest ranch, feeling like she'd crossed into territory where the rules were written in language she'd never learned. Rachel Torres met her at security, walked her through a lobby that had actual art on the walls, not Prince originals, and up elevators that moved so smoothly you barely felt the acceleration. They emerged on the 20th floor where the executive offices lived, where people who made decisions affecting thousands of lives worked in spaces designed to remind them they'd achieved something worth protecting. Jack's office was corner windows offering views of Nashville sprawling toward the Cumberland River. He stood when she entered, moved around his desk with the same careful respect he'd shown in her diner, like the intervening weeks and the context shift hadn't changed whatever calculation he'd made about who deserved deference. Ms. Hayes, thank you for coming. Danny was there too, standing beside his father, and seeing him healthy and whole after remembering him bleeding on her booth did something to Maggie's composure. He smiled when their eyes met, touched his throat where the cross pendant had hung, and she understood he was acknowledging the gift, the exchange, the moment that had bound them, in ways neither had fully articulated. 8 other men stood around the room, the bikers from that storm night, except they weren't bikers. Now they were executives in expensive suits who looked like they ran the world when they weren't riding Harleys through rural Tennessee for recreation and nostalgia. David Parker, Marcus Thompson, Carlos Rodriguez, names she'd learned during that strange night, all of them watching her with expressions that suggested this meeting mattered in ways that transcended business. I need to show you something first. Jack opened a tablet, pulled up a video that looked like security footage. This is from the night Danny's accident happened. The video showed a maintenance bay motorcycles lined up a figure in dark clothes working on one of the bikes with deliberate purpose. The image quality was poor, but sufficient to see brake lines being cut, to see sabotage happening with practiced efficiency. The timestamp read 3 hours before the storm, before the ride that would have killed Danny if different variables hadn't aligned exactly right. This is Tony Marsh. He's worked security for Hutchins Development for 12 years. We traced payments from Victor Hutchins to Marsh totaling $50,000 over the past 6 months, all documented as security consulting, but with timing that matches every incident of harassment you've experienced. Jack pulled up more files, emails between Victor and his staff coordinating the harassment campaign, documentation of anonymous complaints filed through shell companies, financial records, showing payments to health inspectors and fire marshals that lined up precisely with Maggie's violations. We have everything we need to destroy Victor Hutchins legally. Criminal charges for attempted murder, for conspiracy, for a dozen other violations. Civil suits that would bankrupt him and end his development career. We can make this public in ways that would ensure he never works in real estate again. Jack closed the tablet, met Maggie's eyes. But I won't do it unless you agree. Because destroying Victor means destroying Gerald, and Gerald saved your husband's life. So the choice is yours, Ms. Hayes. Justice or mercy. I'll support whatever you decide. Maggie thought about the confession in her purse about Gerald's cancer and his 6 remaining months, about the chain of obligation that connected Firebase Charlie to construction sites, to this 20th floor office where successful men waited for an elderly black woman to define what honor required. I met with Gerald yesterday. She pulled out the confession, handed it to Jack. He told me the truth about 1980, about Henry saving him, not the other way around, about taking credit for something he didn't do. Jack read it, his face darkening with each paragraph. When he finished, he looked at her with something between anger and understanding. He lied for 36 years. He lied because my husband let him lie, because Henry understood that sometimes protecting someone's dignity costs you less than it costs them to lose it. Maggie took the document back, and he told me something else, about how Henry died. She explained about the safety violations, about Henry's complaint 6 weeks before the scaffold collapsed, about negligence dressed up as accident. Watched Jack's hands clench into fists, watched his jaw work as he processed the information, watched him recalibrate everything he thought he knew about debts and obligations. That changes things. His voice was tight with controlled fury. Gerald's debt to Henry was always based on a lie, but this is something else. This is culpability for your husband's death. I know. So what do you want to do? Maggie stood, walked to the windows, looked out over Nashville, building itself into something that might matter someday. She thought about Henry's last words, about helping people, even when they don't deserve it, about separation from darkness, being defined by choosing mercy when vengeance would feel more satisfying. I want to make Gerald Hutchins pay. She turned to face Jack, but not with shame or prison or public destruction. I want him to establish a fund in Henry's name for construction workers injured on job sites. $1 million initial funding, professionally managed, paying out to families who lose income because safety standards weren't maintained. Jack nodded slowly. That's actually more punishment than criminal charges. It forces him to spend the rest of his life funding the exact thing he failed to provide for your husband. It forces him to turn his guilt into something useful, to transform negligence into protection. Maggie's voice was steady. And it means no other family loses someone the way I lost Henry because a foreman decided profit mattered more than safety. And Victor doesn't face criminal charges. You buy my lease for enough to settle all my debts and relocate somewhere he can't reach. You develop that block as affordable housing instead of luxury condos, which kills his $50 million project and ruins his reputation with investors. He lives with failure, but not imprisonment. She paused, making sure Jack understood the calculation. Gerald gets 6 months to see his son destroyed the way his negligence destroyed Henry. That's his real punishment, watching Victor's fall and knowing he set it in motion. Then Gerald dies and takes his secrets with him except for the fund that will keep paying long after he's gone. Jack was quiet for a long moment. Then, that's crueler than I expected from you. It's what Henry would have wanted. Justice that builds something instead of just tearing down. Mercy that costs something instead of being free. Danny stepped forward. There's something else, Ms. Hayes. Something we haven't told you yet. He pulled out his phone, showed her a photo. A skinny teenage boy sitting at a diner counter, tears on his face, looking lost and found simultaneously. The photo was 10 years old, but she recognized it immediately, recognized the booth, the counter, the boy. That's you. Her hand moved to her throat to Danny's cross pendant she'd been wearing since the hospital. You're the boy from 2014. I ran away from home when I was 16. Fought with my dad about everything, about school, about my future, about his expectations. I thought I couldn't meet. I ended up in Memphis with nowhere to go, no money, no plan, except to keep running until something stopped me. Danny's voice carried the weight of confessions that had been rehearsed but never quite feel prepared. I found your diner because it was open late and looked warm. You let me sleep in the back booth for 2 weeks, fed me every day, never asked for payment, never judged me for being scared and angry and stupid. I remember. Maggie's voice was soft. You told me your father was military, that he didn't understand you, that staying home meant becoming someone you didn't want to be. You told me I was wrong. You said running away doesn't solve problems, it just creates new ones. You said my father wasn't trying to hurt me, he was trying to prepare me for a world he knew was harsh. You said love sometimes looks like conflict when people don't know any other way to communicate. Danny's eyes were wet. You made me call home. Stood beside me while I dialed, held my hand, while I told my dad I was sorry, that I was scared, that I wanted to come home, but didn't know how. And he came for me. Drove 4 hours in the middle of the night because his son had finally called. Jack's voice was rough. When Danny came home that night, he told me about an angel in Memphis who ran a diner where everyone belonged, who saw a scared kid and treated him like he mattered. I've been trying to find you for 10 years. The photo, Maggie pulled it from her purse, the Polaroid she'd carried since that confrontation with Victor, the image she'd been studying, trying to understand why Danny's face looked familiar. I took this before you left. Wrote on the back, hope you made it home safe. Danny pulled out his phone again, showed her a scan of the same photo's reverse side, her handwriting preserved digitally. I kept it, looked at it every time I wanted to quit school, quit working for my dad, quit trying to become someone worth the effort you put into saving me. It reminded me that kindness is real, that strangers can see value in you when you can't see it yourself. So the accident, Maggie's mind was working through implications, through connections she'd missed because she'd been too focused on immediate crisis to recognize patterns. It brought you back to me. Victor's sabotage was supposed to pressure you by hurting us. Instead, it brought us to your door, in a storm brought us to the exact place we'd been searching for, gave me the chance to save you the way you saved me. Danny smiled through tears. My dad says God works through storms. This one brought us home. Jack opened another folder, this one thick with documents that looked official and complicated. Ms. Hayes, Maggie, I want to propose something. Not a buyout, not charity, a partnership. He pulled up renderings on his tablet. Maggie's diner transformed but recognizable, expanded, but keeping its soul, modern equipment and more seating, but Henry's photo wall preserved exactly as she'd maintained it for 40 years. This is the Henry Hayes Foundation, a network of community diners built on the model you've been running for 4 decades. Places where veterans help veterans, where families find shelter, where everyone belongs regardless of what their bank accounts say about their worth. We want to make you the founding director. David Parker took over pulling up financial projections. Morrison Industries provides initial capital, $5 million. You own 40% equity. Jack owns 30%, Danny owns 30%. All profits get reinvested in community programs. This isn't business, it's mission. We're building what your husband dreamed about. Henry's dream, Maggie's voice barely worked. Jack pulled out a document yellowed with age, covered in Henry's handwriting. Your husband gave me this in 1995 after that ceremony where I gave him the Community Service Award. He'd sketched out plans for expanding Maggie's place into multiple locations, each one serving as a community hub. He called it winning the peace, using the same principles that helped us survive war to help people survive poverty and displacement and all the other battles that don't make the news. Maggie took the document, recognized Henry's handwriting, immediately saw his vision, laid out in careful detail. Multiple locations, veteran staffing, community programming, all of it designed to create networks of mutual support in neighborhoods that needed them most. He'd been planning this for 30 years and never told her, maybe because the resources didn't exist, maybe because he died before finding a way to make it real. He asked me to help someday if I ever had the means. Jack's voice was thick with emotion. I said yes. Then life happened. He died. I lost track. But the dream stayed alive. And when Danny's accident brought us to your door, when you saved my son the same way you saved him 10 years ago, I realized the dream was still possible. We just needed you. Danny added, we want to name it after him. The Henry Hayes Foundation. Your husband's vision finally realized. Would you lead it? Maggie looked at the renderings, at financial projections that showed what was possible with resources she'd never imagined, at architectural plans that preserved her diner's soul while transforming its capacity. She thought about 40 years of 5 a.m. wake-ups, about serving people who couldn't always pay, about choosing kindness over survival, and watching it cost her everything except the knowledge that she'd done right. What about the original building? Jack hesitated. We'll buy your lease from Gerald for $500,000. That settles Victor's investment, pays his debts, prevents him from claiming financial loss. It also kills his development because we're buying the other properties too, developing them as affordable housing instead of luxury condos. But my diner, we renovate it, 6 months construction. During that time, you operate from a temporary location. We provide full salary and benefits, no gap in income. When it reopens, it's the flagship location for the foundation. Same place, same soul, just equipped to serve more people who need serving. David added, your regular customers, Mr. Patterson, Lisa, and her twins, everyone, they'll know exactly where to find you. The temporary location will be 3 blocks away. We make sure nobody gets lost in the transition. Maggie felt tears start, the kind that come from relief and grief combined, from understanding that loss and gain sometimes arrive in the same moment, wearing the same face. Henry would have loved this. Then say yes. Jack's voice was gentle. Let us honor the debt we owe him by building what he imagined. Let us turn your 40 years of work into a model that helps thousands. Let us prove that kindness isn't just moral, it's practical. It scales, it works. She looked at these men, Jack, who'd been saved by Henry at Firebase, Charlie, Danny, who'd been saved by her in a different war. All the others who'd found in brotherhood something that transcended blood and obligation and the normal limits of human connection. She thought about Henry running into machine gun fire, about choosing to save strangers, when survival meant staying down, about the chain of kindness that connected 1971 to this 20th floor office, where successful men waited for her answer. I have conditions. Name them. Mr. Patterson gets free coffee and toast for life at every location. Any mama's kitchen he walks into, he eats free. Done. Lisa gets executive position, real salary, real benefits, real opportunity for advancement. And her twins get scholarships for college when the time comes. Done. Any teenager who needs help gets it, no questions asked. We create a back booth in every location where kids who are running can find shelter. We train staff to recognize the signs, to offer help without judgment, to call parents when the kids are ready, but never before. Done. Gerald establishes the safety fund, $1 million managed by independent trustees, paying out to construction workers injured because someone valued profit over safety. And he does it publicly with Henry's name on it, so everyone knows why it exists. Done. In the original Maggie's Place, we don't tear it down. We restore it, exactly as it was, exactly as Henry knew it. That building is where his spirit lives. I won't destroy it, even to make it better. Jack smiled. Done. All of it. Anything else? One more thing. Maggie looked at Danny. I want you to tell your story. The 2014 photo, the runaway kid, the woman who helped him. I want every location to have that photo on the wall beside Henry's, so people understand what we're building, so they see that kindness has consequences beyond the immediate moment. Danny nodded, tears running freely now. I'd be honored. Then yes, I'll do it. I'll lead the foundation. I'll teach other locations how to see people the way Henry taught me. I'll make sure his dream gets built right. She paused. But I need to do one thing first. Gerald Hutchins sat in Jack Morrison's conference room, looking smaller than he had in his living room, diminished by surroundings designed to make successful people feel powerful. Maggie sat across from him with Jack beside her, the two of them presenting united front that spoke to debts and obligations that predated this meeting by 50 years. Mr. Hutchins, I've made my decision. Gerald's hands trembled on the table. I'm ready for whatever comes. You're going to establish the Henry Hayes Memorial Safety Fund, $1 million professionally managed, paying out to construction workers injured on job sites where safety standards weren't maintained. You're going to do it publicly with press releases and ceremonies and Henry's name on every check that goes out. I will, gladly. And you're going to spend your last 6 months watching your son's reputation collapse, watching his development project fail, watching him lose everything he valued because you taught him that money matters more than people. Gerald's face went gray. That's crueler than prison. That's justice that builds something instead of just destroying. You get to see your mistakes bear fruit. You get to understand exactly what your negligence cost. And then you get to die knowing that Henry's name will be attached to something that prevents other families from experiencing what I experienced. She stood preparing to leave. Victor doesn't go to prison, he just fails. Publicly. Completely. That's his punishment for trying to erase a community for profit. And yours is watching it happen and knowing you made him capable of it. Gerald was crying now, shoulders shaking with sobs he was too old to control. I'm sorry, God, I'm so sorry. Sorry doesn't rebuild what you destroyed, but useful action might make your last months mean something. Maggie's voice softened slightly. My husband forgave you 36 years ago when he went along with your lie. I'm forgiving you now by not taking your confession to prosecutors. But forgiveness doesn't mean no consequences. It means consequences designed to create something better than what was broken. She walked out of the conference room and didn't look back. 3 months after that meeting, Maggie stood outside her diner watching construction crews transform 40 years of her life into something that preserved the past while building toward a future she'd never quite let herself imagine. The building was gutted to studs, then rebuilt with modern systems that would pass any inspection, then furnished with equipment that would have seemed like science fiction when she and Henry bought this place in 1984. But Henry's photo wall was intact, carefully preserved and expanded. His military medals, their wedding photo, the 2014 Polaroid of Danny, all of it remained as anchor points, reminding everyone who entered what this place was built on. New photos joined the old ones, Lisa's twins, Mr. Patterson, dozens of other faces representing lives touched by simple kindness, delivered consistently over decades. The fire that came in month 2 wasn't Victor's work. Investigations confirmed electrical fault. From the renovation insurance paid out, nobody was injured. But it destroyed Henry's trophy case, melted the metals Maggie hadn't sold, turned physical artifacts into ash and memory. She'd stood in the parking lot at 3 a.m. watching firefighters save the structure while the contents burned and felt something break in wine that she hadn't known was still whole. Jack found her there, put his arm around her shoulders in a gesture that would have been presumptuous a year ago but felt necessary now. I'm sorry, Maggie, I know those things mattered. Henry's not in things. Her voice was steady even though her face was wet. He's in what we're building, in everyone who got help when they needed it, in Danny and Lisa and Mr. Patterson and all the others. The things were just proof, but we don't need proof anymore. We've got this. She gestured at the building at the foundation, taking shape at the future assembling itself from the wreckage of the past. Reopening day arrived 6 months after construction began exactly on schedule because Morrison Industries didn't miss deadlines. The new Maggie's place was stunning 80 seats and clusters that encouraged conversation commercial kitchen that could train a dozen students simultaneously community room for meetings and classes, and the kind of programming that transforms restaurants into something more essential. But it felt like home. That was the miracle. Despite all the changes, despite modern equipment and professional design and resources, Maggie had never imagined it felt like the place she and Henry had built. Their spirits were in the walls and the layout, in the fundamental understanding that this was a space where everyone belonged. Mayor's ribbon cutting at 10 a.m., cameras and speeches, and politicians saying the right things about community and investment and the importance of small businesses. Maggie stood beside Jack and Danny and smiled for photos while her mind was already calculating when could they actually open? When could she start serving the people who'd been waiting 6 months for this moment? 11 a.m., they opened the doors. Mr. Patterson was first in line, had been waiting since 9, his VFW cap slightly crooked and his cane steady and his smile bright enough to light Memphis if properly harnessed. He shuffled to the counter, pulled out 75 cents, ordered coffee and toast like nothing had changed. Maggie poured his coffee in the same chipped mug she'd kept through construction and fire and everything that came between. Pushed back the money. Mr. Patterson, you eat free now. That's the policy. You and every veteran who walks through that door. Maggie, I can pay. I know you can. But some things aren't about payment. They're about honor. You honored us with your loyalty when everyone else walked away. We honor you by making sure you never go hungry. He took the coffee with shaking hands. Some things never change. Some things shouldn't. By noon, the place was full. Lisa behind the counter managing staff with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing you're good at what you do and being paid appropriately for the first time in your life. Her twins at table 6 doing homework unchanged except for being 2 years older and more certain that the world contained spaces where they belonged. Construction workers from Carlos's crew back now that Hutchins Development no longer controlled their contracts. Neighborhood families who'd stayed away during the scandal returning now that fear had been replaced by understanding. And new faces. People who'd heard about the foundation, about the diner where everyone belongs, regardless of their ability to pay. Veterans looking for connection. Families needing shelter from storms, both meteorological and metaphorical. Teenagers with that particular look of running from something they can't quite name finding in Maggie's place. What Danny had found 10 years ago. Someone who saw value in them when they couldn't see it themselves. Maggie moved through the crowd serving coffee and collecting stories and remembering why she'd spent 40 years doing this work for wages that never quite added up to financial security. It wasn't about money. It had never been about money. It was about creating a space where human worth wasn't calculated by bank accounts or employment status or any of the other metrics society uses to sort people into categories of valuable and expendable. Jack sat at the counter watching her work, and something in his expression made her pause. They'd been circling around something for months now, ever since the night they'd ridden through flooded streets together, ever since she'd saved his son, and he'd saved her business. An obligation had transformed into something that felt like the beginning of connection. You're smiling, she said, refilling his coffee, though he hadn't asked. Just thinking about Sarah, my wife. She died 5 years ago, cancer. Toward the end, she made me promise I'd find someone who understood about duty and honor and the importance of building something that outlasts you. He looked at Maggie directly. I think she'd have liked you a lot. Henry would have liked you too, would have recognized a fellow Marine, someone who understood about brotherhood and debts that can't be fully repaid. Do you think, Jack started out again. Do you think they'd mind if you, what, Jack Morrison, if I wanted to keep doing this, the work, the foundation, all of it, but also, he trailed off, couldn't quite finish the sentence, looked vulnerable in ways that billionaire CEOs probably aren't supposed to look. Maggie's hand found his on the counter, held it gently. I think Henry would want me to keep living. I think Sarah would want you to keep building. I think we honor them best by not stopping just because they had to. So you're saying, I'm saying let's take it slow. Let's keep working together, keep building the foundation, keep seeing where this goes. Maybe someday it becomes something more. Maybe it stays what it is. Either way, we're both less alone than we were. Jack's smile was worth the risk of saying it. I can live with that. 5 years after that reopening, Maggie stood in the original location now called Maggie's Place, legacy site flagship, of 12 locations spanning 6 states and watched another storm approach. Weather Service was calling it significant warnings across Memphis about flooding and potential tornadoes, the kind of storm that makes people remember other storms and the moments when everything changed. She was 78 now, moving slower, hair completely white, but still coming in at 5 a.m. because some habits transcend age and physical limitation. Still serving coffee to Mr. Patterson, who was 92 and shouldn't still be alive, except stubbornness had its own kind of medical value. Still making sure Lisa, now regional operations director, earning six figures and putting both twins through college, had everything she needed to manage three locations simultaneously. Still wearing Danny's cross pendant beside a small gold motorcycle pin from the Atlanta location and a silver diner charm from the Detroit franchise, each piece of jewelry representing a life touched, a community transformed, a promise kept to a man who'd taught her that kindness scales if you're willing to do the work. As the storm rolled in, people arrived, not just from the immediate neighborhood, but from across Memphis. People who'd learned that Maggie's place was where you went when weather turned biblical. The dining room filled with families and veterans and teenagers and elderly people who remembered other storms, other emergencies, other moments when strangers became neighbors. Because crisis has a way of revealing that the categories we use to separate ourselves are less solid than we think. Jack arrived at 7 p.m. with Danny and Danny's two children, 10 and 8, now calling Maggie Grandma in the unself-conscious way children adopt family members who show up consistently. The rest of the original bikers came too, bringing their families, filling booths and tables until the place looked like a party, except everyone understood the party was actually a shelter. Actually a reminder that community is what happens when people decide to face danger together instead of separately. At 8 p.m., a teenage girl appeared in the doorway. 16, maybe 17, soaking wet from rain that had started an hour ago and was building towards something more serious. She had that look, the one Maggie recognized from Danny 10 years ago, from dozens of other kids over 4 decades, from anyone who's running from something they can't name but can feel chasing them. Maggie approached without hesitation. "Come on in, honey. Let's get you dried off and fed." The girl stepped back, defensive eyes scanning for threat. "Why would you help me? You don't know me. Don't need to know you to help you. That's not how this works. Everyone wants something." "You're right," Maggie smiled gently. "I do want something. I want you to believe you're worth saving. I want you to know you're not alone. I want you to have the chance my boy had when he showed up here scared and certain nobody cared." She pointed to the wall, to the 2014 photo of Danny beside Henry's Purple Heart. "That's him. He was you once. Thought his life was over. Thought nobody understood. But we did. And we care about you too, even though we just met." Danny stood from his booth, walked over, showed the girl his phone with the same photo magnified. "She's telling the truth. I sat where you're standing. Thought I had nowhere to go, nobody who'd understand. Maggie saved my life. Not with money or a place to sleep. She saved it by seeing me as human when I'd stopped seeing myself that way." The girl's resistance broke, years of accumulated trauma releasing in sobs that bent her double. Maggie caught her, held her, let her cry against a shoulder that had absorbed similar tears from dozens of kids over decades of this work. "It's okay, baby. Let it out. You're safe now. We've got you." Lisa brought blankets and hot chocolate. Mr. Patterson offered his jacket. "You'll catch cold, young lady." Other customers made room, offered smiles, created space for one more person who needed to belong somewhere, even if just for a night. Jack stood beside Maggie, watching the scene play out with the practiced choreography of people who'd done this dance before. His hand found hers, held it gently. "You did it. Built what Henry dreamed. We did it. All of us. Couldn't have happened without you, without Danny, without everyone who believed kindness was practical, not just theoretical." Do you ever regret it? Opening that door the first night, everything that came after. Maggie thought about the 3 months of harassment, about losing her business before gaining something larger, about the fire that destroyed Henry's physical artifacts, about Mr. Patterson dying peacefully 2 months ago. After 92 years of survival, he credited to having somewhere he mattered. She thought about Lisa's twins thriving in college, studying social work because Grandma Maggie showed us how to care. She thought about Jennifer, the girl from tonight, who would stay with them, who would eventually manage the Phoenix location, who would spend her life helping others the way she'd been helped. "I almost didn't," she admitted. "I almost kept that door locked. Almost let fear make my decisions. But Henry's voice reminded me that angels come disguised as the people we're most afraid of." She looked around at the packed diner, at families sheltering together, and at strangers helping strangers, because crisis had transformed them temporarily into community. At Jack beside her, their hands linked in the comfortable way of people who'd found in each other something they'd stopped expecting. At the teenage girl wrapped in blankets, beginning to believe she might survive whatever she was running from. Opening that door was the scariest thing I ever did, and the best thing, because it taught me that sometimes salvation looks like crisis, sometimes help comes from unexpected places, sometimes the people we're most afraid of turn out to be exactly who we need. Thunder shook the building. Lightning turned the world white through windows streaming with rain. But inside Maggie's place, it was warm and bright and full of the kind of hope that gets generated when people refuse to let fear dictate terms, when kindness scales through repetition and commitment, when ordinary humans decide that maybe everyone deserves to belong somewhere, regardless of what their circumstances say about their worth. The storm raged outside, but in here they were safe. They were fed. They were home. And somewhere in whatever place souls go when bodies give out. Henry Hayes watched his widow build the dream he'd sketched on paper 30 years ago, watched Jack Morrison repay a debt that could never really be repaid, watched strangers become family, because one elderly woman had been brave enough to unlock her door during a storm, and trust that angels sometimes wear leather and ride motorcycles through floodwaters to reach the people who need them most. Some doors once opened can never quite close again. The light gets out, the warmth spreads, and the world becomes slightly less dark for everyone standing near enough to feel it. That's the real miracle, not transformation or salvation or any of the grand words people use when they want to make kindness sound impressive. Just doors opening, just warmth spreading, just one person after another deciding that maybe we don't have to face our storms alone. Maybe that's enough. Maybe that's everything.